Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The heat in Nevada can make you do stupid things. And maybe that's my excuse for ignoring every warning I got that Saturday in early September. I'd been driving through the desert for weeks, documenting ghost towns for my dissertation on economic collapse in mining communities. And honestly, after visiting 12 settlements that were nothing but foundation stones and rusty nails, I was getting desperate for something substantial. The old-timer at the gas station in Searchlight kept wiping the same spot on the counter while he talked, his eyes never quite meeting mine, telling me about this place 40 miles northwest that nobody visits anymore. Not since the flooding in the mine back in '78, he said. Not since those families disappeared. But I needed this. My advisor had already rejected 2 thesis proposals, and turning 31 while still chasing a PhD was starting to feel like running in quicksand. The road out there wasn't on any map I had, just a dirt track that branched off the highway near mile marker 47, exactly where the gas station owner said it would be. My Subaru kicked up dust clouds that hung in the rearview mirror like ghosts, and after 20 minutes of washboard roads that rattled my teeth, I saw the first structures rising from the desert floor. There were maybe 15 buildings still standing, their wood bleached white as bones, windows nothing but dark squares that seemed to watch my approach. I parked near what looked like the old general store, its sign hanging by one chain, creaking in the wind even though I couldn't feel any breeze. The silence hit me first, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes your ears ring, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I grabbed my camera and notebook, telling myself the unease crawling up my spine was just excitement about finally finding an intact site. The first thing that didn't make sense was the footprints. Fresh ones, maybe a day old at most, leading from behind the general store toward a cluster of collapsed shacks near the mine entrance. I followed them, my boots crunching on the hard-packed dirt, and that's when I noticed the trailer. It sat between 2 fallen buildings like someone had deliberately hidden it there. Aluminum siding still shiny under layers of dust. Definitely not from the mining era. A heavy padlock secured the door, the kind you'd buy at Home Depot, not some antique rusted thing. I was photographing it when I heard the music, faint, tinny, like an old radio playing from somewhere inside. My hand hesitated on the door handle, and I pressed my ear against the warm metal. Definitely music. Some country song I didn't recognize, barely audible, but unmistakably there. I should have left right then. Should have driven straight back to Searchlight and deleted the photos, forgotten the whole place existed. But I kept thinking about my thesis, about the rejection letters, about spending another year waiting tables while my college friends were buying houses and having kids. So I walked deeper into the settlement, documenting everything with my camera, taking notes on the unusual preservation of certain structures. The sun was getting lower, painting long shadows across the desert floor, and I found myself at the mine entrance, a gaping mouth in the hillside, reinforced with timber that looked surprisingly solid. More footprints led inside, lots of them, different shoe sizes, some going in, some coming out. The air flowing from the mine felt cooler, carrying a smell like motor oil and something else, something organic that made me step back instinctively. That's when I saw the generator. It was tucked behind a pile of rotting lumber near the mine entrance, a yellow Caterpillar model, industrial-sized with fresh fuel cans stacked beside it. The thing wasn't running, but when I touched the engine block, warmth still radiated from the metal. Someone had used it recently, maybe within the last few hours. My phone showed 5:47 p.m., and I realized I'd been there longer than planned, the desert already turning that deep orange that comes before dark. I started walking back toward my car, faster now, when I noticed something else that made me stop cold. Tire tracks, fresh ones, multiple sets, crisscrossing the main path through town. They hadn't been there when I arrived. I was sure of it because I'd specifically photographed that area for its undisturbed sand patterns. The logical part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe locals used this place for parties, or perhaps someone was salvaging metal from the ruins. But those explanations crumbled when I reached my car and found a folded piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, expecting maybe a warning from local teenagers or a note from another researcher. Instead, there was a single line written in pencil. "You need to leave before they count the inventory." No signature, nothing else. Just those 8 words that made absolutely no sense but somehow felt like the most important message I'd ever received. I looked around the empty settlement, at the shadows growing longer between buildings, and for the first time, noticed how many corners and doorways could hide someone watching. I threw my gear in the back seat and fumbled for my keys, every instinct screaming at me to get out now. The engine turned over on the 3rd try and I was reversing when I saw them. 3 sets of headlights in the distance, maybe 2 miles out, bouncing along the access road toward the settlement. They were moving fast, too fast for casual visitors or lost tourists, and they were definitely coming this way. There was nowhere else that road led. I slammed the car into drive and headed for the exit, but as I passed the trailer with the music, the door was open. Wide open, padlock hanging loose, and I could see inside for just a second as my headlights swept past. Rows of shelving, like a pharmacy, filled with labeled containers, and in the back, several people sitting very still on benches, their faces turned away from the light. My Subaru fishtailed as I hit the dirt road too fast, dust clouding everything behind me. Those headlights were gaining, eating up the distance between us like they knew exactly where I was going. I called my roommate, needed to tell someone where I was in case. The call connected and I started talking fast, giving her the location, describing the turnoff at mile marker 47, but the signal cut out mid-sentence just as I was explaining about the trailer. No bars, no service, nothing. The phone was completely dead even though I'd charged it that morning. In the rearview mirror, the headlights had spread out, one staying behind me while the other 2 disappeared onto parallel paths I hadn't even known existed. They were trying to box me in, and I realized with perfect, terrifying clarity that they knew this desert better than I ever would. The main road was still 10 minutes away, but suddenly there were headlights in front of me too, coming from a side trail that materialized out of the darkness. I yanked the wheel hard left, leaving the road entirely, praying the Subaru could handle the raw desert terrain. The car bucked and pitched over rocks and scrub brush, my teeth clacking together with each impact, the steering wheel trying to tear itself from my grip. Behind me, 2 of the vehicles followed while the 3rd stayed on the road, probably waiting for me to circle back. These weren't random locals or scavengers. They moved with coordination, purpose, like they'd done this before. My headlights caught a flash of an old wooden sign barely visible in the sagebrush. Grayson Mine Shaft 3. Danger, keep out. Without thinking, I drove straight toward it, hoping maybe the old mining roads would give me an advantage. The shaft entrance loomed in my headlights, a timber-framed hole cut into a low hill, and I saw my only chance. There was a dirt path running alongside it, probably an old maintenance road, narrow but passable. I killed my headlights and engine simultaneously, letting momentum carry me into the deeper shadows beside the mine entrance. The Subaru rolled to a stop behind a pile of rusted mining equipment, and I held my breath, watching through the rear window as the pursuing headlights swept past, then stopped, then started backing up. They'd lost me for a moment, but not for long. I could hear doors slamming, voices calling out to each other in the darkness, organized and calm like they were conducting a routine search. One of them had a flashlight, one of those powerful spotlights that turned night into day, and it was sweeping methodically through the area where I'd left the road. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of staying with the car, I grabbed my backpack and slipped out the passenger door, staying low, moving toward the mine entrance. The shaft went back about 30 feet before hitting a collapse, but there was a side passage, partially hidden behind fallen timbers. I squeezed through, the space so tight my shoulders scraped both walls, and found myself in a slightly wider chamber. Old tools hung on the walls, pickaxes, shovels, things that hadn't been touched in decades, and there was another narrow passage leading deeper. I could hear them outside getting closer, one voice saying they found fresh tire tracks leading toward the mine. The spotlight beam swept across the entrance and I pressed myself deeper into the passage, feeling my way in complete darkness, my breathing so loud I was sure they'd hear it echoing off the stone walls. I stayed in that mine for 6 hours, moving deeper whenever I heard them getting close, navigating by touch through passages that seemed to connect in a maze of tunnels. Around midnight, the sounds finally stopped, but I waited another 2 hours before creeping back toward the entrance. My car was gone, not a trace of it anywhere, like it had never existed. I had to walk 8 miles through the desert to reach the highway, hiding whenever headlights appeared, finally flagging down a truck driver at dawn who took me back to Searchlight. When I reported everything to the police, they found my Subaru 3 days later, hidden under a brown tarp in one of the mine shafts 2 miles from where I'd abandoned it. The engine was still warm, they said, even though it had been missing for days. The trailer was gone, the footprints were gone, even the generator had vanished. The only thing they found was my camera sitting on the driver's seat, all the photos deleted except one, a picture I didn't take, showing the inside of that trailer, rows and rows of people sitting on benches, all of them looking directly at the camera with the same empty expression. The Mojave stretched out in front of me like an endless ocean of dust and Joshua trees, and I remember thinking how perfect the light was that October morning. I'd been chasing desert kit foxes for 3 weeks straight, sleeping in my truck and living off granola bars and bottled water. The kind of solitary work that made my editor at National Geographic question my sanity every time we talked on the satellite phone. My divorce had finalized 6 months earlier, right after my 37th birthday, and throwing myself into documenting endangered species seemed healthier than sitting in my empty apartment in Phoenix. The assignment was simple enough: capture behavioral footage of the foxes during their breeding season, something that hadn't been properly documented in over a decade. I'd already gotten some decent shots near Kelso Dunes, but I wanted something special, something that would make the magazine's front cover and remind everyone why I used to win awards before my life fell apart. I turned off the main highway about an hour earlier, following a Forest Service map that promised an old mining road leading to untouched habitat. The dirt track was rougher than expected, full of washouts from last winter's flash floods, and my pickup crawled along at maybe 10 miles per hour, while dust devils danced across the barren landscape. That's when I spotted the van, maybe a quarter mile ahead, parked sideways across the narrow road like someone had tried to turn around but gave up halfway through. Both doors hung open like broken wings, and even from a distance I could see camping gear scattered on the ground. A blue sleeping bag unrolled in the dirt, a Coleman stove tipped on its side, plastic water bottles reflecting the morning sun. My first thought was some city folks had gotten lost, maybe ran out of gas or got spooked by the isolation, because you'd be amazed how many people underestimate the desert and end up needing rescue. I pulled up about 20 feet behind the van and killed my engine, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of driving. The vehicle was a white Ford Econoline, probably from the early 2000s, with Arizona plates covered in so much dust I had to squint to read the numbers. No sounds came from inside, no movement except for a piece of paper fluttering on the driver's seat, held down by what looked like a thermos. I called out a greeting, then another louder one, but my voice just disappeared into the vastness around us. The smart thing would have been to radio the situation in and keep driving, but the scattered gear bothered me in a way I couldn't quite explain. Everything looked too deliberate, too organized despite the chaos, like someone had carefully arranged their belongings before walking away. The sleeping bag wasn't just dropped, but unrolled perfectly straight, the water bottles lined up in a row beside it, and when I walked closer, I noticed a digital camera on a tripod pointing toward the horizon, its red recording light still blinking steadily. The inside of the van hit me with a wave of stale air, and something else, something metallic and wrong that made me breathe through my mouth. The front seats were covered in manila folders, loose papers, and what looked like printouts from missing persons' websites. faces of young women and men staring up at me with hopeful smiles from happier times. But it was the document on the driver's seat that stopped me cold. A half-completed police report form from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department, dated just 3 days ago. The officer's name at the top read, Deputy James Holbrook, badge number 4827, and the incident type was listed as Suspicious Activity Investigation. Most of the form was blank, but under the preliminary notes section, someone had written in shaky handwriting, multiple subjects confirmed at coordinates, appears to be underground storage, requesting immediate backup before proceeding. Below that, a topographical map of the area was spread out, marked with red X's at various points, and a dark brown stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood had soaked through one corner, obscuring part of the legend. My satellite phone was back in the truck, and every instinct told me to grab it and call for help immediately. But those red marks on the map, they weren't random. One of them matched exactly where I was standing, and another marked a spot about 2 miles north, near what the map labeled as Coyote Dry Lake. The bloodstain covered a third mark, but I could make out enough to see it was near an abandoned borax mine I'd passed yesterday. What really made my pulse quicken were the photographs paper-clipped to the folders, surveillance-style shots of different vehicles parked at gas stations, rest stops, and campgrounds throughout the region. Each photo had a date and timestamp in the corner, some going back months, and I recognized a few of the locations from my own travels through the area. One folder was labeled Pattern Analysis in neat handwriting, completely different from the shaky scrawl on the police report, and inside were charts tracking disappearances by date, location, and victim profile, all centered around a 50-mile radius of where I now stood. The rationalization started immediately, that comforting voice in your head that tries to explain away the obvious horror. Maybe Holbrook was an off-duty cop doing his own investigation. Maybe he was a private investigator hired by desperate families. Maybe the blood was from a nosebleed or a cut hand. But then I found the deputy's badge under the passenger seat, along with his service weapon, a Glock 22 with a full magazine. And nobody, absolutely nobody in law enforcement leaves those things behind voluntarily. The radio mounted on the dashboard was smashed, wires hanging loose like exposed nerves, and when I looked closer at the driver's seat, I could see fingernail marks gouged deep into the fabric, as if someone had been dragged out while fighting to stay inside. The keys were still in the ignition, the engine cold but the battery still working, which meant the van hadn't been here more than a day or two at most. Through the back windows, I could see more equipment, zip ties, rope, a shovel, heavy-duty trash bags, and a handheld GPS unit still showing the last searched coordinates, which pointed directly to the dry lake bed marked on the bloody map. I should have left right then, should have driven straight back to civilization and let the authorities handle whatever nightmare was unfolding in this forgotten corner of the desert. But those faces in the missing persons reports kept staring at me, and one of them, a young woman named Kayla Brennan from Flagstaff, had disappeared just last week according to the printout. Her parents were offering a $50,000 reward, and in her photo she wore a turquoise necklace, identical to one I'd seen glinting in the dirt near the van's rear tire. The GPS coordinates on that handheld unit were only 2 miles away, and if there was even a chance someone was still alive out there, if Deputy Holbrook had found something before whatever happened to him, then I couldn't just drive away. I grabbed the Glock, checking the chamber and safety like my ex-military brother had taught me years ago, tucked the GPS unit in my pocket along with my satellite phone, and started walking north toward the coordinates, telling myself I'd just look from a distance, just confirm what was there before calling for help. The desert heat was already climbing toward unbearable as I followed a narrow wash that led toward the dry lake, my photographer's eye automatically noting how the morning shadows played across the ancient rocks and scattered bones of long-dead animals. Every few hundred yards, I found more evidence that someone had been through here recently. Fresh boot prints in the sandy patches, a crushed energy drink can that hadn't been there long enough to fade in the sun, and strangest of all, small fluorescent orange flags stuck in the ground at regular intervals, like someone was marking a trail. The GPS showed I was getting closer to the coordinates, and through my telephoto lens, I could make out what looked like a cluster of old shipping containers near the edge of the lake bed, their rust-colored surfaces almost invisible against the surrounding rocks. But it was the smell that hit me first, carried on the light breeze, a sweet, sick odor that anyone who's spent time in war zones or disaster areas recognizes immediately. Death has a very particular scent in the desert, where the dry air mummifies rather than decomposes, and this wasn't the smell of one body, but several, mixed with something chemical and sharp that burned the inside of my nostrils. The shipping containers were arranged in a rough semicircle, partially buried in the alkali soil of the dried lake, and someone had welded them together with steel plates to create one continuous structure. Heavy chains and industrial padlocks secured the doors, but one container at the far end stood open, its entrance a black rectangle that seemed to swallow the morning light. Fresh tire tracks led right up to it, multiple sets overlapping, and scattered around were more personal items. A woman's sneaker, a baseball cap with a University of Arizona logo, a wallet splayed open in the dirt with credit cards spilling out. I recognized Deputy Holbrook's handwriting on a notepad near the entrance, pages flapping in the wind, documenting license plate numbers, dates, and what looked like delivery schedules for something called Project Coyote. The last entry, written in increasingly erratic script, simply read, "They know I'm here, can hear the trucks coming back. If anyone finds this, the main site is 5 miles northeast, Old Garrison Mine. They've been using it since 2018. At least 30 missing. Still alive underground. Tell my wife." The sentence ended mid-word, the pen mark dragging off the page in a long, desperate line. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the weight of the Glock suddenly feeling inadequate against whatever operation was happening here. Through the open container door, I could see industrial shelving stocked with medical supplies, IV bags, restraints, and dozens of those blue pharmaceutical coolers that hospitals use for organ transport. A generator hummed somewhere inside, keeping refrigeration units running, and a work table near the entrance held surgical instruments laid out on sterile cloth, recently used and waiting to be cleaned. The realization of what this place was, what someone was doing out here in the middle of nowhere, hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just murder or kidnapping. This was something systematically worse, something that required infrastructure and planning and multiple people working together. The sound of an engine in the distance snapped me back to immediate danger, dust rising maybe 2 miles away and heading directly toward the containers, moving fast across the desert floor in a way that suggested whoever was driving knew exactly where they were going. Running back through the desert felt like one of those nightmares where your legs won't work properly, the soft sand grabbing at my boots while the sound of engines grew louder behind me. I made it to my truck and immediately called 911 on the satellite phone, but the connection was terrible, cutting in and out as I tried to explain what I'd found. The dispatcher kept asking me to repeat my location, and I was screaming the GPS coordinates when I saw 2 vehicles crest a ridge behind me, modified pickup trucks with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows. I threw the truck in drive and floored it, the rear wheels spinning before catching traction, and started the most terrifying drive of my life back toward the main highway. They followed for about 10 miles, staying just close enough to let me know they were there before suddenly stopping at what must have been some predetermined boundary. I didn't stop driving until I reached a highway patrol station in Barstow, where I spent the next 6 hours giving statements, looking at photos, and watching the disbelief on officers' faces slowly turn to alarm as they verified parts of my story. The raid on the containers happened that night, a joint operation between FBI, ATF, and local law enforcement that made national news for about 3 days before being buried under other headlines. They found the remains of 14 people in various states of decomposition, the underground facility at Garrison Mine that Holbrook had mentioned, and enough evidence to arrest 7 individuals connected to what investigators called a medical trafficking ring. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. They never found Deputy James Holbrook, dead or alive, and 23 people from those missing persons files remain unaccounted for. The prosecutor said the ring had been operating for at least 6 years, targeting travelers and drifters, people whose disappearances wouldn't immediately raise alarms. I testified at the trial, showed my photographs, and watched as 3 doctors, 2 EMTs, and 2 men identified only as logistics coordinators received life sentences. But during the trial, one of the defendants smiled at me from across the courtroom and mouthed the words, "There are others." And I knew he wasn't lying. I still photograph wildlife, but I don't work alone in remote areas anymore. And every time I see an abandoned vehicle on a desert road, I keep driving and call it in from a safe distance, because some things in the desert are meant to stay hidden, and some horrors are all too human. Friday afternoon in early August changed everything about how I see the desert around Alamogordo. I run a small electronics repair shop downtown, and when Detective Vasquez walked through my door carrying a damaged phone in an evidence bag, I figured it would be just another data recovery job for the police department. He was a stocky guy with graying temples who explained they needed help accessing the contents of a phone belonging to a missing person. According to the report he placed on my counter, Natalie Dunn had just turned 26 in July, making her 2 years younger than me. She'd driven out here alone from Ohio to film content for her travel channel, one of those YouTube ventures where people document their solo adventures in remote places. Her parents had called the authorities after she failed to check in for 3 days straight, and search teams found her silver Subaru Outback abandoned on a dirt road about 15 miles from the main highway, locked from the inside with all her camping gear still packed neatly in the trunk. My fingers worked carefully around the spider-webbed glass as I connected the phone to my recovery equipment. When I finally bypassed the damaged screen and pulled up her GPS history, the data showed something that made both Detective Vasquez and me exchange worried glances. Her last recorded location was about 20 miles from where they found the car, deep inside what I immediately recognized as military-restricted territory near the missile range. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. on the night she disappeared, and after that, absolute nothing. Just that single frozen coordinate pulsing on my monitor, like a digital beacon in the middle of nowhere. Detective Vasquez leaned closer, his coffee breath filling the space between us, and asked if I could recover any photos or videos from that day. Natalie had filmed everything, apparently planning to edit it all into a vlog episode about desert camping. And as the video files began loading one by one, we found ourselves watching them right there in my shop, instead of just transferring them to the evidence drive like we should have. Her first video that morning showed her standing beside her Subaru at a gas station, huge sunglasses reflecting the early sunshine while she held her camera at arm's length. She had this infectious energy, talking about how she'd been planning this trip for months, wanting to capture the real desert experience away from tourist spots. Natalie explained she'd researched lesser-known areas around White Sands, spots where she could get dramatic footage without crowds of people in the background. She showed her supplies: 5 gallons of water, enough food for 3 days, a satellite phone for emergencies, and a bright orange tent she joked would be visible from space. What struck me was how prepared she seemed, checking off items from a laminated list while narrating her safety protocols. She even mentioned telling her parents her exact route and that she'd check in every evening at 8. The detective paused the video to make notes, and I noticed his pen hovering when she mentioned she'd hired a local guide named Carson to show her some photography spots, though she planned to camp alone. Video number 2 started around noon with the camera mounted on her dashboard, capturing the endless stretch of desert highway while she sang along to some pop song I didn't recognize. She pulled over several times to film the landscape, each shot showing her getting more excited about the isolation and beauty of the area. At one point, she stood on a rock formation and slowly panned the camera in a complete circle, showing nothing but desert scrub and distant mountains in every direction. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said to the camera, her voice filled with genuine awe. "No cell towers, no buildings, just pure wilderness." Around the fourth hour of driving footage, she met up with Carson at a crossroads. A lanky guy in his 40s wearing a weathered cowboy hat who pointed out various directions on her map, his finger tracing roads that weren't on any GPS. Detective Vasquez asked me to zoom in on the map, but the video quality made it impossible to read the markings clearly. After Carson left, Natalie continued alone, following what looked like a barely visible dirt track that wound between clusters of yucca plants and Joshua trees. By late afternoon in her videos, the landscape had transformed into something almost alien. She'd reached an area where the sand had this strange grayish-white color, and she kept stopping to film herself sifting it through her fingers, marveling at how fine it was compared to regular sand. The sun was getting lower, casting these long, dramatic shadows that she used for artistic shots of her footprints disappearing into the distance. Around 6 p.m., she found what she called the perfect spot, a flat area surrounded by low hills that would block the wind but still give her a view of the stars. She set up her orange tent with practiced efficiency, narrating each step for her future viewers, explaining how to properly stake down a tent in loose sand, and why she'd chosen this particular model for desert camping. While she worked, she kept glancing at something behind the camera and at one point said, "That's weird, I didn't see those earlier." But the camera was facing her tent, so we couldn't see what she meant. Detective Vasquez rewound that part 3 times, and we both noticed how her cheerful demeanor had shifted slightly, though she quickly went back to her upbeat narration. Her sunset footage was genuinely beautiful, the desert bathed in gold and purple light while she cooked freeze-dried pasta on her portable stove. She'd positioned the camera on a tripod to film herself preparing dinner, talking about how peaceful everything was, how the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. But around 7:30 p.m., something changed in the videos. She kept turning to look behind her, and twice she stood up suddenly and walked out of frame for several minutes, leaving the camera running on an empty camp chair. When she came back the second time, she forced a laugh and said the desert was playing tricks on her eyes, making her think she saw lights where there couldn't possibly be any. She tried to maintain her vlogger personality, but her voice had this strained quality, and she kept losing her train of thought mid-sentence. At exactly 8 p.m., she made her check-in call on the satellite phone, and we could hear her telling her parents everything was fine, that she was having an amazing time. But after she hung up, she sat there staring at the phone for a full minute before whispering to the camera, "I need to move the car." The next video clip started with the camera shaking wildly as she hurried back to her Subaru in the growing darkness. Her breathing was heavy and ragged, and she kept muttering things like, "This isn't right," and "They shouldn't be here." When she reached the car, she fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice in the sand before managing to unlock the door. She threw the camera onto the passenger seat, and for a few seconds all we could see was the ceiling light and her arm reaching for the ignition. The engine turned over but didn't start. She tried again, pumping the gas pedal, and this time it roared to life. But then she just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, and in the dim light from the dashboard, we could see tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave the tent," she said to nobody in particular. "All my stuff is there. They'll know I was here." She wiped her face with her sleeve and grabbed the camera again, and what she said next made Detective Vasquez pause the video to call his supervisor. "If something happens to me," Natalie said, looking directly into the lens. "Carson knew about this place. He kept asking questions about whether I'd be alone, and he marked something on my map that I didn't ask for. I think he sent them here." Detective Vasquez left to make his calls while I continued watching the videos, and what I saw next still gives me nightmares. Natalie had driven her car about a mile from her campsite, parking it behind a large rock formation, then walked back to her tent with just the camera and a flashlight. The footage was jerky and chaotic, her flashlight beam swinging wildly across the desert floor, creating monstrous shadows from every small bush and rock. When she reached her campsite, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her tent was exactly as she'd left it, but there were tire tracks circling it, deep grooves in the sand from what looked like multiple vehicles. She approached slowly, camera held high, and that's when we heard it. Men's voices, at least 3 different ones, coming from somewhere beyond the range of her flashlight. They were speaking in low tones, but one phrase came through clearly. She couldn't have gone far on foot. Natalie immediately switched off her flashlight, and the camera's night vision kicked in, showing her crouched behind her tent in that eerie green glow. She was trying to control her breathing, but small whimpers kept escaping. The voices were getting closer, and we could hear footsteps crunching through the sand, along with the metallic clink of what sounded like tools or weapons. For about 10 minutes, the video showed nothing but darkness and the sound of Natalie's terrified breathing. Occasionally, flashlight beams would sweep across the area above her head, and she'd press herself lower into the sand. Then came a moment that made me physically sick to watch. One of the men walked right past her tent, so close that his boots were visible in the frame for a few seconds. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and what looked like night vision goggles pushed up on his forehead. "She's got to be around here somewhere," he called out to the others. "Check if she doubled back to the rocks." Another voice, older and gravelly, responded from further away. "Told Carson this was too public. Should have waited until she was further into the restricted zone." They continued searching, their lights crisscrossing the desert. And at one point, 2 of them stood directly in front of her tent, discussing whether to slash it open to check inside. Natalie had buried her face in the sand to muffle her breathing, and the camera caught her whole body trembling violently. They eventually moved away, but not before one of them said something that explained everything. "Radio says the test is still scheduled for midnight. We need to find her and get out before then." What happened next was pure chaos captured in fragments of shaky footage. Natalie tried to crawl away from the campsite on her belly, dragging herself through the sand with the camera clutched in one hand. But about 50 yards out, a spotlight suddenly blazed to life, catching her in its beam. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the camera recording wild glimpses of ground and sky as men shouted behind her. We could hear engines starting and the sound of vehicles pursuing her across the desert. She ran toward what she must have thought was the direction of her hidden car, but in the darkness and panic, she'd gotten turned around. The last coherent video showed her stumbling down into a ravine, losing her footing on the loose sand and tumbling down the slope. The camera flew from her hand and landed several feet away, still recording. In the frame, we could see her lying motionless at the bottom for a few seconds, before she slowly pushed herself up and looked around frantically for the camera. Her face was covered in sand and blood from a cut on her forehead, and her eyes had this wild, desperate look. She grabbed the camera and whispered, "They're herding me toward the test area. They want it to look like an accident." Then she turned it off, and the next file was from her phone, just audio, recorded at 11:43 p.m. The audio file was 4 minutes of pure terror, heavy breathing, stumbling footsteps, and Natalie's voice barely above a whisper, trying to leave a final record. "I found a drainage pipe under the fence," she gasped. "Made it through to the other side, but I think this is the restricted area Carson marked. There's these concrete structures everywhere, old bunkers or something." In the background, we could hear distant shouting and what sounded like helicopters. "They're not following me in here," she continued, her voice shaking. "They're just waiting at the fence line. Why aren't they following?" There was a long pause filled only with her labored breathing, then a sound that made Detective Vasquez and me look at each other in horror. A mechanical voice over loudspeakers echoing across the desert. "Weapons test commencing in T-minus 15 minutes. All personnel clear the target zone immediately." Natalie let out a sob. Oh God. They knew. They knew about the test. They chased me right into it. The last 2 minutes were her running, the phone apparently in her pocket, recording nothing but muffled thuds and her desperate breathing. Then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the audio cut to static for about 10 seconds before ending completely. That static wasn't from damage. I've analyzed it 100 times. It was electromagnetic interference, the kind you get from a massive electrical discharge. Detective Vasquez returned with 2 federal agents who immediately confiscated all the files and made me sign a stack of non-disclosure agreements. They said Natalie had accidentally entered an active military testing ground, that her death was a tragic accident, and that Carson was just a local guide with no connection to anything sinister. But before they took everything, I'd already made copies. I'm not stupid, and something about this whole thing stank. I did my own digging and found out that Carson disappeared the same night Natalie died, and his truck was found burned out in Mexico a week later. The test that night? Officially, it never happened. There's no record of any weapons test at White Sands on that date. But I found something else. 3 other missing persons cases over the past 5 years, all solo travelers who'd hired local guides, all whose vehicles were found abandoned near restricted areas. The official causes of death when bodies were found were always exposure or dehydration. Natural causes, accidents. I think about Natalie every night, about how prepared she was, how careful, and how none of it mattered because she trusted the wrong person. I keep her last video backed up in places the feds will never find, because someday, when I figure out who's really behind this, the world needs to know what happened to her and the others. They weren't accidents. They were hunted. My Subaru's odometer hit 127,000 miles somewhere between Blythe and the trailhead, and I remember thinking that both the car and I had seen better days. At 37, with divorce papers still fresh enough that I kept reaching for a wedding ring that wasn't there anymore, I'd decided 5 days alone in the Sonoran Desert would either fix me or break me completely. Either option seemed better than another night staring at the ceiling of my empty apartment in Los Angeles. I'd been doing these solo desert hikes since college, back when my knees didn't protest after 10 miles, and a 40-pound pack felt like freedom instead of punishment. That morning in early October, I loaded enough supplies for 5 days and headed toward the Palo Verde Mountains, where forgotten mining roads cut through land that most people only glimpse from Interstate 10. My plan was straightforward. Park at the trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, and let the silence do whatever it needed to do. 12 miles in by late afternoon, my GPS showed an old service road that probably hadn't seen a maintenance crew since Reagan was president. I found a perfect spot between 2 ridges, a natural depression that offered wind protection while staying high enough to avoid any flash flood channels. Setting up my worn 2-person ultralight tent, I watched the October sun turn everything into shades of gold and rust, even making the decades-old beer cans scattered around look almost artistic. The temperature hovered around 75, with that particular desert heat that evaporates sweat before you realize you're sweating. No cell service out here, no emails, just miles of creosote bushes and the occasional jackrabbit bolting between rocks. I got my camp stove running for some freeze-dried pasta, optimistically labeled Alpine Minestrone, then sat on a flat rock to watch the sun drop toward the horizon. For the first time in months, that knot in my chest started to loosen. Just as the last slice of sun disappeared behind the western ridge, I stood up to grab my headlamp from the tent, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the sandy patch about 15 feet from my tent, clear and deep, like someone had been standing there for a while. The tread pattern was distinctive, some kind of military or work boot with deep chevrons, and they led straight toward my tent from the direction of the old service road. But here's what made me stop and stare. There were no prints leading away, just this one set coming toward my camp, and then nothing. I walked a full circle around my tent, checking every possible angle, thinking maybe the wind had obscured the exit tracks or they'd walked out on the rocky sections where prints wouldn't show. The rocks could hide footsteps, sure, but the approach was all soft sand and gravel, and those prints were fresh, maybe an hour or 2 old at most, the edges still sharp and crumbling. I tried to rationalize it while making dinner, telling myself that someone had probably hiked through earlier, maybe another desert rat like me looking for solitude. They saw my tent going up, decided to give me space, and backed out the way they came, stepping in their own tracks. It happens sometimes when you're trying not to disturb other campers, but the more I looked at those prints, the less sense that made. The spacing was wrong for someone walking backward, and the depth was too consistent. like they'd stood in each spot deliberately, watching. By the time I finished eating, full dark had settled over the desert, and I kept my headlamp on longer than necessary, sweeping it across the empty landscape every few minutes. The silence out there was absolute, not even wind through the creosote, just my own breathing and the tick of my camp stove cooling down. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of gravel shifting outside my tent. Not the random scatter of a small animal, but deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps trying to be quiet. The sound would come in sets of 3 or 4, then stop for maybe 30 seconds, then start again, always from the same direction as those boot prints. I lay there in my sleeping bag, every muscle rigid, listening to what I gradually realized was breathing. Slow, controlled breathing just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent, maybe 3 feet from where my head was. I could hear the slight wheeze at the end of each exhale, like someone with mild asthma, or maybe just winded from hiking. My knife was in my pack's side pocket, but reaching for it meant making noise, and some primal part of my brain insisted that staying perfectly still was the only thing keeping that canvas barrier between us intact. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes according to the glowing digits on my watch. Sometimes it moved, circling the tent slowly, pausing longest near the zippered entrance. I kept waiting for the zipper to move, for fingers to test the fabric, for something to escalate this beyond just presence. But whoever it was seemed content just to stand there, breathing in that measured way, occasionally shifting their weight on the gravel. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sounds stopped. No footsteps walking away, no gradual fade into distance, just an abrupt end to the breathing and the gravel sounds. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. I lay awake until dawn, my hand wrapped around the knife I'd finally retrieved, listening to nothing and wondering if nothing was actually nothing. First light couldn't come fast enough, and when it finally did, I unzipped my tent with the knife still in my hand, half expecting to find someone standing there. Instead, I found new boot prints, the same chevron pattern, but this time they formed a complete circle around my tent, maybe 6 feet out. The circle was perfect, like whoever made it had used my tent as the center point and walked around it multiple times, layering print over print. But the part that made my throat go dry was where the freshest set ended, right at the foot of my tent, toes pointing directly at where I'd been sleeping. The sand there was compressed differently, 2 deeper impressions like someone had stood in that exact spot for a long time, just watching the tent. I grabbed my phone to take pictures, needing some kind of proof that I wasn't losing it out here, and that's when I noticed something that turned my stomach cold. My phone showed 37 photos I didn't remember taking, all from around 3 in the morning. Every single photo was taken in complete darkness, the flash illuminating portions of desert landscape, and one recurring subject, my tent. The first few were from maybe 50 feet away, showing my little orange shelter glowing in the flash like a beacon. Then they got progressively closer, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5. The last dozen were taken from different angles around that perfect circle I'd found in the sand, each one showing my tent from a slightly different perspective. In one, you could see the shadow of my body through the fabric, curled up in my sleeping bag. The timestamp showed they were all taken within a 15-minute window, right around the time I'd been lying there, listening to those footsteps, gripping my knife. But here's what really got me. In the last photo, taken from right beside the tent entrance, you could see a partial reflection in the tent's rainfly. A face, distorted by the curve of the fabric, but definitely human. Male, I thought, with hollow cheeks and eyes that caught the flash in a way that made them look silver. I should have packed up right then, hiked the 12 miles back to my car, and gotten the hell out of there. That would have been the smart move, the sane move. But something in me, maybe pride or maybe just the stubborn refusal to let some desert creep run me off, made me decide to stay one more night. I spent the day hiking the surrounding area, partly to clear my head, and partly to look for any sign of where this person might be camping. The old service road showed tire tracks from maybe a month ago, nothing recent, and I found no other tents, no fire rings, no trash, Nothing to indicate anyone else was out here. Around noon, I climbed to the top of the eastern ridge and scanned the valley with my binoculars. Nothing but empty desert stretching for miles, heat shimmer making the distant mountains dance. I told myself whoever it was had probably moved on. Some weirdo with a camera who got his kick scaring solo hikers. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself the second night would be peaceful. I set up a perimeter of sorts, stringing paracord with my bear bell attached between some creosote bushes about 20 feet from my tent. Not exactly high-tech security, but it would at least give me warning if someone approached. I also moved my sleeping position, putting my pack where my head would normally be and lying the opposite direction in my bag. If someone was watching through the fabric again, they'd get the layout wrong. As darkness fell, I kept my headlamp off, sitting outside the tent and letting my eyes adjust to the starlight. The Milky Way stretched overhead, so bright you could read by it, and for a while the beauty of it made me forget why I was sitting there like a guard dog. Around 10, I finally crawled into my tent, keeping my boots on and my knife within easy reach. I lay there listening to the desert sounds, a distant coyote, the rustle of a kangaroo rat, the normal night music that should have been comforting. The bear bell never rang. That's what I keep coming back to, even now. My little alarm system stayed completely silent, but around 2 in the morning, I woke to find my tent glowing faintly from outside. Not the sharp, sudden blast of a flashlight, but a soft, steady illumination, like someone was holding a lantern just far enough away to light up the orange fabric without casting distinct shadows. The light moved slowly, circling the tent counterclockwise, pausing every few feet. I could hear footsteps this time, deliberate and unhurried, and that same wheeze-touched breathing from the night before. But what made every hair on my body stand up was the sound that came next. My own voice, playing from what must have been a phone speaker, saying words I'd spoken earlier that day while hiking. 37 and starting over, my recorded voice said, tinny and distant. Either fix me or break me completely. The recording repeated those phrases over and over, mixed with the sound of my footsteps on gravel, my breathing from the climb up the ridge, even the zip of my tent from that morning. When the light finally stopped moving, it settled right where my head should have been if I hadn't switched positions. The person outside pressed something against the tent fabric, and I heard the distinctive click of a camera shutter, followed by the whir of an instant photo printing. They did this maybe a dozen times, each click followed by that mechanical whir, and I could hear them carefully placing each photo on the ground. The breathing got closer, so close I could smell something through the tent fabric. Sweat, yes, but also something chemical, like darkroom developer fluid. Then, in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in days, raw and cracking, they spoke just one word: wrong. The light clicked off and I heard footsteps moving away, not trying to be quiet anymore, just walking straight out into the desert. This time I could track them getting fainter and fainter until they blended into the ambient noise of the night. I didn't move, didn't breathe deeply, didn't even shift position until dawn broke 3 hours later. Outside my tent that morning, arranged in a semicircle where my head should have been, were 12 instant photos. Each one showed my tent from the exact same angle, taken moments apart, creating a kind of stop-motion effect of the fabric moving slightly in the night breeze. But in the center photo, circled in what looked like red grease pencil, was the faint outline of my pack through the tent wall, right where I'd positioned it as a decoy. The word "wrong" was written across the bottom of that photo in the same red pencil, the letters pressed so hard they'd torn through parts of the image. I packed up faster than I'd ever broken camp before, practically running the 12 miles back to the trailhead, my neck cramping from looking behind me every few seconds. My car was untouched, thank God, though I found one more instant photo tucked under the windshield wiper, a picture of me from behind, taken the morning before as I'd hiked away from the parking area, completely unaware I was being followed. I drove straight to the Riverside County Sheriff's Station in Blythe and filed a report showing them all the photos on my phone and the instant pictures I'd gathered up. The deputy who took my statement, an older guy named Hernandez, listened to everything with this expression that got more concerned as I went on. He told me there'd been similar reports over the past 2 years. Always solo hikers, always in that same general area near the Palo Verde Mountains. Nobody had ever been hurt, but several people had cut their trips short after experiences like mine. They'd increased patrols on the service roads, but whoever was doing this knew the desert better than anyone. Probably lived out there full time, moving camp constantly. Hernandez kept the instant photos as evidence and gave me his card, said to call if I remembered anything else. 3 months later, he called me. They'd found an abandoned camp about 5 miles from where I'd been, hidden in a narrow canyon. Dozens of instant photos scattered around, all of different tents, different campers, spanning what looked like years. A collection of recorded sounds on old cassette tapes. Voices, footsteps, tent zippers, camp stoves. But whoever had been living there was gone, leaving only boot prints that ended at the rocks, heading deeper into the desert. They never found him, and as far as I know, they're still looking. I haven't been back to the desert since. The assignment had come through on a Friday afternoon, right when I'd been contemplating whether freelance photography was still paying enough to keep me in 29 Palms. Some boutique travel magazine wanted desert sunrise shots for their spring issue, offering triple my usual rate if I could deliver within the week. My landlord had been calling about February's rent, which meant saying no wasn't really an option. I loaded my Jeep Cherokee that night, checking the weather reports obsessively while packing every lens I owned. Clear skies predicted for the next 4 days. Perfect conditions for what they wanted. The editor had been specific about wanting something different, something that captured the raw isolation of the high desert, away from all the typical tourist spots everyone photographs to death. I left my apartment at 3 in the morning on Saturday, driving out past the main entrance to Joshua Tree and heading toward the northern boundary where hardly anyone ventures. The service roads out there were mostly forgotten, used maybe once or twice a year by maintenance crews checking on old communication towers from the 60s. I'd scouted the area on Google Earth the night before, finding a ridge that would give me an unobstructed view of the sunrise hitting the valley below. The turnoff appeared right where the satellite images said it would be, marked by a rusted yellow gate hanging open and a sign that read, "No maintenance beyond this point" in faded red letters. The road beyond looked rough but manageable, just packed dirt and gravel disappearing into the darkness. I shifted into 4-wheel drive and kept going, figuring the worst that could happen was having to reverse back out if things got too sketchy. About 3 miles in, the road started deteriorating fast. What had been packed dirt turned into loose sand with deep ruts carved by flash floods from who knows how many seasons back. The Cherokee was handling it fine though, and according to my GPS, I only had another mile to reach the spot I'd marked. The headlights kept catching Joshua trees at weird angles, their twisted arms creating shadows that made them look like people frozen mid-dance. I remember thinking how perfect this was going to be for the shoot, how the magazine would eat up shots from a place this remote and untouched. The dashboard clock showed 4:47 when I finally reached the ridge, giving me just enough time to set up before the golden hour started. I could already see the faintest hint of blue on the eastern horizon, that beautiful gradient from black to indigo that only happens in the desert. I pulled off the main track onto what looked like a flat clearing, perfect for parking while I worked. The sand seemed firm enough when I first drove onto it, compacted by wind and occasional rain into something that felt almost like concrete. I grabbed my main camera bag and tripod from the back, leaving the engine running with the headlights on so I could see what I was doing. The spot I wanted was about 50 feet from the car, right at the edge where the ridge dropped off into the valley. Setting up the tripod in the dark while wearing a headlamp always makes me feel like some kind of desert astronomer, adjusting legs and checking levels while the rest of the world sleeps. After getting everything positioned, I realized I needed my wide-angle lens instead of the telephoto I'd mounted, so I jogged back to the Cherokee to grab it from my second bag. That's when I noticed the Cherokee had shifted. Not much, maybe 6 inches backward from where I'd parked it, but enough that the front wheels had settled deeper into what I now realized was much softer sand than it appeared. The headlights were angled slightly upward instead of straight ahead. I threw the car into reverse to back it onto firmer ground, just a quick adjustment, maybe 3 feet at most. The wheels spun freely, that high-pitched whine that every desert driver knows means trouble. I tried rocking it forward and back, gentle on the gas, keeping the wheel straight. The Cherokee sank another few inches. The sand under the front tires had turned into powder, the kind that flows like water once you break through the crusty surface. I turned off the engine and sat there for a minute, my headlamp beam catching the dust particles still floating from my attempt to move. No cell signal, obviously. I knew that coming in. But I had water, food, and the weather was mild for early February. Someone would come looking if I didn't deliver the photos by Monday. I tried digging out the front wheels with my hands first, then with a collapsible shovel I kept in the emergency kit. The more I dug, the more sand flowed back in, like trying to make a hole in a bucket of flour. The sun was starting to rise behind me, painting the valley in shades of orange and pink that would have been absolutely perfect for the assignment. I actually took a few shots while I was thinking, muscle memory taking over even while my brain worked through the problem. By full daylight around 7:30, I'd accepted that I wasn't getting the Cherokee out on my own. The temperature was already climbing, probably hitting 70 degrees, and I could see heat shimmer starting to form on the distant mountains. I decided to record a video message on my phone around noon, when the heat was making me dizzy despite drinking water constantly. Just a quick thing to send to my roommate Wendy once I found signal, explaining where I was, and that I needed someone with a truck and tow rope. I propped the phone against a rock and sat in the shade of the Cherokee, trying to look casual rather than desperate. "Hey Wendy, really stupid situation here," I started, managing a laugh that sounded forced even to me. "Remember that assignment I mentioned? Well, I'm stuck out on a service road north of Joshua Tree, about 4 miles from Highway 62, past a yellow gate with a no-maintenance sign. I gave her the GPS coordinates from my camera, described the Cherokee's position, told her to bring Keith and his F-150. The video ran for maybe 2 minutes before the phone screen went black. Dead battery. I'd been using it as a backup GPS all morning, and the heat had drained what little charge remained. The charger cable was in the Cherokee, but the car battery had died an hour earlier from my attempts to rock it free. The wind started picking up around 3 that afternoon. Nothing major at first, just enough to blow sand into my eyes whenever I stood up. I took shelter in the Cherokee, doors closed, watching the Joshua trees bend and sway through the dusty windshield. Then I saw something that made me sit up straight. Way off in the distance, maybe half a mile down the service road, a dust cloud was moving toward me. Not the random swirls from the wind, but a focused column like a vehicle would make. I grabbed my camera with the telephoto lens, using it like binoculars to get a better look. Through the viewfinder, I could just make out what looked like a dark-colored truck, moving slow but steady up the road. Relief flooded through me so hard I actually laughed out loud. Someone else had decided to brave the service road, probably another photographer chasing the same remote beauty that had lured me here. I stepped out of the Cherokee, waving both arms above my head, already rehearsing my embarrassed explanation and grateful thanks for the rescue. The truck stopped about 300 yards away. Just stopped, engine still running from what I could tell by the exhaust shimmer, but not moving any closer. I kept waving, even jumped up and down a few times, figuring maybe they couldn't see me clearly through the blowing sand. The vehicle sat there for what must have been 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Then slowly, it started backing up, reversing down the exact path it had come. I screamed at them to wait, actually screamed until my throat went raw, but the sound got swallowed by the wind. Through the camera lens, I watched the truck disappear back into the desert haze, that dust column gradually fading until there was nothing left but empty road and my own disbelief. My brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe they thought I was dangerous. Maybe they were lost themselves. Maybe they didn't even see me. But something about how deliberately they'd stopped, waited, and then reversed made my chest tighten with a fear I couldn't name. The wind got serious as the sun started dropping toward the horizon. Not a dust storm exactly, but what locals call a blow, where the sand gets picked up in sheets and visibility drops to maybe 100 feet. I huddled in the Cherokee, feeling it rock with each gust, sand hissing against the windows like static on a dead TV channel. That's when I noticed the other set of tire tracks. Fresh ones, maybe a few hours old at most, running parallel to the service road about 20 feet away. They weren't from the truck I'd just seen. These were wider, deeper, like from something heavier. The tracks went about 50 yards past my position before curving sharply back toward the road and disappearing. Someone else had been here recently, close enough to see my stuck vehicle but hadn't stopped or left any sign. I took photos of the tracks with my camera, switching to manual focus because the autofocus couldn't handle the blowing sand. In the last shot, just as the memory card filled up, I caught something else. Headlights in the distance, multiple sets this time, arranged in a pattern that didn't make sense for normal traffic. Night fell hard and fast once the sun dropped behind the mountains. The wind had died down to occasional gusts, but the darkness out there was absolute, the kind where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I turned on the Cherokee's interior light briefly to organize my water bottles, trying to ration what I had left for however long this would take. That's when I heard the engines, not one vehicle but several, circling somewhere out in the darkness beyond where I could see. They'd drive close enough that I could hear the crunch of tires on sand, then pull away again, over and over like some kind of game. I stayed frozen in the driver's seat, interior light off now, barely breathing. The sound patterns weren't random. They were coordinated, like they were taking turns approaching from different angles. At one point, high beams flooded the Cherokee's interior so bright I had to shield my eyes, staying on for maybe 30 seconds before cutting out completely. Then silence. Complete, total silence that stretched on for hours until I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Dawn came gray and hazy through a thick coat of dust on the windshield. The Cherokee was half buried, sand piled up to the bottom of the doors on the windward side. I forced the door open and stumbled out, my legs cramped from sitting rigid all night. The desert looked different, reformed by the wind into new patterns and small dunes. All the tire tracks from the night before were gone, erased like they'd never existed. My water was down to half a bottle, my lips cracked and bleeding despite the chapstick I'd been applying obsessively. I made the decision to leave the Cherokee and walk back to the main road, taking just my camera and the remaining water. But when I tried to orient myself, nothing looked familiar. The service road I'd driven in on was completely obscured, covered by fresh sand with no trace of the path. Even the distant mountains looked wrong, like I was seeing them from a different angle. That's when I understood with perfect, terrible clarity that whoever had been circling in the darkness hadn't been playing a game. They'd been waiting for the storm to do its work, waiting for the desert to erase everything, waiting for me to make exactly this choice. I started walking anyway, using the sun to head roughly east toward where Highway 62 should be. Every few hundred yards, I'd stop and scan the horizon with my camera's telephoto, looking for any sign of the road or power lines or anything human-made. About an hour in, I spotted vehicles again, 2 pickup trucks parked on a rise maybe a quarter mile to my south, just sitting there with what looked like people standing beside them, watching me through binoculars. When I changed direction to walk toward them, they got back in their trucks and drove away, maintaining that same quarter-mile distance. When I stopped, they stopped. When I moved, they moved. Like they were hurting me, keeping me walking in a specific direction. The heat was brutal by mid-morning, probably pushing 95 degrees, and my water was gone. I tried doubling back toward the Cherokee, but every time I turned around, one of the trucks would swing wide to block that direction, forcing me to keep going east into increasingly rough terrain. By noon, I couldn't walk anymore. I found a small overhang in a rock formation and collapsed in its shade, my camera still hanging around my neck out of pure habit. The trucks had disappeared again, but I knew they were out there, waiting. I managed to turn the camera on one last time, scrolling through the photos I'd taken. The sunrise shots that had brought me here, the tire tracks in the sand, and that final image of the approaching headlights. I deleted everything else to save battery and recorded one more video, whispering because my throat was too dry to speak normally, explaining everything that had happened, describing the trucks, the deliberate way they'd trapped me. The camera died halfway through a sentence. That's when I heard a helicopter in the distance and started laughing, thinking I was hallucinating. But it was real. A sheriff's department chopper that had spotted the Cherokee's roof still visible above the sand. They found me unconscious about 200 yards from the rock formation. Apparently, I'd tried to signal them and collapsed. The rescue team said they'd been searching since Monday when the magazine called asking about the photos. The sheriff's department never found any evidence of the trucks I described. No tire tracks, no sign of other vehicles in the area for weeks according to them. They suggested dehydration and heat exhaustion had caused hallucinations, which apparently happens a lot in rescue situations. Maybe they were right, but when they returned my camera from the Cherokee, that last photo was still there on the memory card, the one with multiple headlights approaching in formation through the dust. The sheriff's deputy who looked at it said it was probably just lens flare from the setting sun, combined with blowing sand. Nothing unusual for desert photography. He seemed pretty convinced, even showed me similar effects in other desert photos online. I didn't tell him about the video I'd recorded on the camera, the one that should have been there but wasn't, like it had never existed. I didn't mention that the timestamp on that last photo showed 11:47 p.m., hours after sunset, when there was no sun to create lens flare. I just thanked them for saving my life, collected my insurance payout for the buried Cherokee, and moved to Portland 2 weeks later. I still do photography, but only urban stuff now, buildings, people, city life. Sometimes editors ask if I'd consider taking desert assignments again, offering good money for that isolated beauty everyone wants to capture. I always politely decline. Whatever was out there circling in the darkness that night, whether it was real or something my stressed mind created, I have no interest in meeting it again. My 14-year-old daughter Amber spotted it first, pressing her face against the dusty window of our SUV and pointing at something orange flickering between the creosote bushes. We were 2 hours into the dirt roads outside Furnace Creek, searching for a camping spot away from the crowds when she started tugging at my shoulder from the back seat. Her younger brother Max was asleep with his head against her arm, drooling slightly, exhausted from waking up at 4 in the morning for this trip. I'd been teaching 8th grade biology in Bakersfield for almost 2 decades, planning this Death Valley expedition since winter break, convincing my wife Lisa that we could handle 3 days of primitive camping with the kids. She'd finally agreed, taking time off from her pharmacy job, though she kept checking her phone for signal every few minutes, worried about being completely disconnected. What Amber had seen made me slow the vehicle to a stop, squinting through the afternoon glare at a half-collapsed tent about 50 yards from the road. Orange fabric whipped in the wind like a flag of surrender. One side completely caved in while the other 3 poles still stood at awkward angles. A ring of stones marked where someone had built a fire, the charred wood inside arranged in a perfect teepee formation that had long since burned out. But the strangest part was what sat beside it. A pile of clothing folded with military precision, each piece stacked on top of the other, as if someone had carefully organized their entire wardrobe before walking away. Lisa noticed them too, leaning forward between the seats, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she asked why anyone would leave their clothes arranged like that in the middle of nowhere. Against Lisa's protests, I decided we should report it to a ranger, just in case someone needed help or had gotten lost out here. Max woke up when I turned off the engine, rubbing his eyes and immediately asking for water, while Amber was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to investigate. I told them both to stay in the car with the air conditioning running while I walked over to check things out. The ground between us and the abandoned camp was nothing but loose gravel and scattered Joshua trees, their twisted arms reaching toward a cloudless sky. As I got closer, I could see more details. The tent was a decent brand, probably expensive when it was new, with reinforced corners and heavy-duty zippers. The clothes were all men's, different sizes of shirts and pants, even socks rolled into perfect balls, and strangest of all, a pair of hiking boots placed neatly at the end of the pile with the laces tucked inside. I took photos with my phone, making sure to capture everything from multiple angles, then jogged back to the SUV where my family waited. Lisa had that look on her face, the one she got when she had to tell relatives bad news at the pharmacy, all tight lips and worried eyes. We drove another mile down the road before finding our intended camping spot, a flat area protected by a cluster of large boulders that would block the worst of the afternoon sun. While Lisa and the kids started setting up our tent, I tried calling the ranger station, but of course there was no signal. We had a satellite emergency beacon for real emergencies, but this didn't quite seem to warrant that level of response. I made a mental note of the GPS coordinates and figured we'd report it when we drove back toward the visitor center for our Day 2 supply run. That first night passed peacefully enough, though I kept waking up every few hours, listening to the desert sounds outside our tent. Coyotes called to each other across the valley, their yips echoing off the canyon walls, and once I heard something large walking through our camp, probably a bighorn sheep based on the hoof sounds on the rocks. Lisa slept fitfully beside me, mumbling in her sleep about work, while the kids were dead to the world in their sleeping bags. Around 5 in the morning, just as the sky started turning purple at the edges, I gave up on sleep and crawled out to start the camp stove for coffee. The abandoned tent was still visible in the distance, a dark shape against the lighter sand, and I noticed buzzards had started circling above it, 3 of them making lazy loops in the warming air. After breakfast, we decided to hike to a small peak about 2 miles from camp, following an old mining trail I'd read about online. The kids complained for the first half hour, Max dragging his feet and asking every 5 minutes if we could turn back. But once we started finding old rusted equipment from the 1800s, they perked up considerably. Amber found a purple glass bottle half buried in the sand, probably from some patent medicine, and Max discovered what looked like part of an ore cart wheel. Lisa stayed close to me, holding my hand whenever the trail narrowed, still uneasy about the abandoned camp we'd found. We reached the summit around noon, the temperature already climbing toward triple digits, and ate lunch while looking out over the valley spread below us like a brown ocean frozen in time. That's when we saw the ranger's truck, a white speck moving along the road far below, stopping exactly where we'd seen the abandoned tent. The hike back down took longer than expected because Max had started developing blisters, and we had to stop every few hundred yards to adjust the moleskin on his heels. By the time we reached our camp, around 3 in the afternoon, the heat had become oppressive, turning the air into a shimmering curtain that made everything in the distance wobble like a mirage. The kids immediately retreated into the tent to play cards, while Lisa and I sat in our folding chairs under a tarp we'd strung between the SUV and a large boulder. We were sharing a warm beer, the last one from our cooler that had any pretense of being cold, when we heard a vehicle approaching. A Park Service truck pulled up beside our SUV, and a ranger stepped out, a tall woman with sun-damaged skin and wraparound sunglasses that reflected our camp like tiny mirrors. She introduced herself as Ranger Colton and asked if we'd seen anything unusual in the area. I told her about the abandoned camp we'd spotted yesterday, even showed her the photos on my phone, zooming in on the folded clothes and the collapsed tent. She studied each image carefully, her expression never changing, then handed my phone back and said something that made my chest tighten. That camp had been cleared 6 months ago, she said, after a 3-week search and rescue operation for a geology professor from UC Davis and 2 graduate students who'd gone missing. They'd found the tent exactly as I'd photographed it, clothes folded the same way, but no bodies, no tracks leading away, nothing to indicate where the 3 men had gone. The area had been thoroughly searched with dogs, helicopters, even thermal imaging drones at night. She said they'd removed everything, documented it all for the investigation, and she'd personally supervised loading the tent and belongings into evidence bags. Yet here I was showing her pictures from yesterday, of the exact same scene, down to the way the socks were rolled and the boots positioned. Ranger Colton asked to see the GPS coordinates on my phone, then radioed someone, speaking in codes I didn't understand before switching to plain English. She wanted backup to check the site again, mentioned something about another occurrence, and told whoever was on the other end to bring the special documentation kit. While she waited for the response, she walked around our camp, examining our setup with an intensity that made me uncomfortable, taking photos of our tent, our vehicle, even our camping chairs arranged around the dead fire pit. Lisa came out of the tent where she'd been checking on the kids, and I could see her pharmacy training kick in as she read the ranger's body language, the way she positioned herself between Colton and the tent entrance. The ranger noticed and forced a professional smile, telling us we should consider moving to the developed campground near Stovepipe Wells, that this area had been having some issues lately that they were investigating. We might have taken her advice if the kids hadn't been so tired and cranky from the heat, and if packing up didn't mean another 2 hours of driving on rough roads. Lisa and I discussed it quietly, while Ranger Colton walked back to her truck to make more radio calls, and we decided to stay just one more night, leave first thing in the morning. The ranger didn't seem happy about our decision, gave us her direct radio frequency and told us to call immediately if we noticed anything unusual, and I mean anything, she emphasized, even if it seemed minor. After she left, driving back toward where we'd seen the abandoned camp, the afternoon felt heavier somehow, like the desert itself was holding its breath. We made dinner early, nobody talking much, and were all in our sleeping bags by 8 o'clock when the last light faded from the sky. I remember checking my watch at exactly 11:47 p.m. when I heard the first sound that didn't belong, the distinct metallic whisper of a zipper being pulled, slow and deliberate, somewhere very close to our tent. I lay perfectly still, every muscle rigid, listening to that zipper moving tooth by tooth in the darkness outside. Lisa was breathing deeply beside me, and I could hear both kids snoring softly in their bags, none of them aware of what was happening. The zipper stopped, and for maybe 30 seconds there was absolute silence, the kind that makes your ears ring from the absence of sound. Then I heard footsteps, not the random scuff of an animal, but measured, careful steps circling our tent, pausing every few feet like someone was examining our setup. My hand found the flashlight I'd kept beside my pillow, fingers wrapping around the metal cylinder while I tried to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped directly outside the wall where Lisa was sleeping, and I could hear breathing, slow and controlled, inches from the tent fabric. That's when I noticed our tent zipper, the main entrance, was moving, the pull tab sliding upward so slowly I could barely see it in the dim starlight filtering through the mesh window. The zipper had moved about 6 inches when Amber suddenly cried out in her sleep a sharp "no" that cut through the silence like a gunshot. The movement stopped instantly, and I heard the footsteps retreat quickly, not running but walking fast, controlled, heading away from our camp. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent in one motion, bursting outside with the beam sweeping across the desert, catching nothing but empty sand and the shadows of Joshua trees. Our tent had been cut, a clean diagonal slash through the rainfly about 3 feet long, edges so straight it looked like someone had used a razor. I woke Lisa, whispered what had happened while she pulled the kids close, their sleepy confusion turning to fear when they saw my face. We packed everything in 20 minutes, throwing gear into the SUV without bothering to fold or organize, and started driving out with our headlights cutting through the darkness. About a mile down the road, my light swept across the spot where the abandoned camp had been, and the tent was gone, the fire ring scattered, but the clothes were still there, now arranged in a perfect circle on the ground with the boots placed dead center, laces tied together in an intricate knot I'd never seen before. We drove straight through the night, nobody sleeping, the kids huddled together in the back seat while Lisa kept checking the mirrors for headlights that never came. When we finally reached the visitor center at dawn, I marched inside to file a report with the first ranger I found, a young guy named Howell who looked like he'd just started his shift. I showed him the photos, told him about Ranger Colton's visit, the tent being cut, everything that had happened. He typed it all into his computer, nodding along, then stopped mid-keystroke when I mentioned Colton's name. He turned his monitor toward me, showing a staff directory, and asked me to point her out. But she wasn't there. No Ranger Colton on the current roster. No tall woman with sun-damaged skin matching her description. Howell made some calls, checked with dispatch about yesterday's patrol schedules, and came back looking puzzled. No ranger had been assigned to that area yesterday, and nobody had reported checking on an abandoned campsite or talking to my family. The investigation that followed turned up nothing concrete, just more questions that nobody could answer. The photos on my phone were real, the slash in our tent was real, but there was no record of Ranger Colton, no evidence of the abandoned camp when a team went back to check, and no explanation for how items from a cleared crime scene had reappeared 6 months later. The Park Service filed it as vandalism and suspicious activity, gave us a case number, and that was that. We never went back to Death Valley, never even talked about camping again as a family. Lisa found a therapist for the kids, told them it was probably just someone playing a cruel prank, maybe some locals who didn't like tourists. But sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I think about those clothes arranged in that perfect circle, about whoever was breathing outside our tent, and about Ranger Colton, who knew exactly what was happening in that desert but doesn't exist. I still have the photos on my phone, proof that we saw what we saw, but I've stopped showing them to people because the looks they give me are worse than not being believed at all. The trail was supposed to be simple, barely 6 miles total, looping around a stretch of dry land dotted with brittle shrubs and sandstone ridges. I had driven out early that morning, eager to clear my head and take a few photos before the light faded. Hiking alone never bothered me. In fact, it was something I did to disconnect from everything that felt too loud. The plan was to park near the small rest area, follow the path to the ridge, and be back before sunset. The air smelled of dust and something faintly metallic, like a storm that never came. Even then it felt different from any hike I had done before, as if the desert itself was paying attention. I remember the silence more than anything else. It was not peaceful, just heavy, the kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing your own heartbeat. Every step I took kicked up small whirlwinds of pale dust that settled around my boots before vanishing again. My backpack was light, a single bottle of water, my camera, a snack bar, and my phone. The GPS app marked the trail perfectly at first, the little blue dot following the dotted line as expected. Then about halfway through, the signal flickered for a moment, and when it came back, I noticed I had drifted slightly east. I told myself it was fine. The sun was high, and I could always backtrack. By late afternoon, the heat had turned into something oppressive. The light changed in a way that is hard to explain, less golden, more like an old photograph starting to fade at the edges. I decided to cut across a flat area to rejoin the main trail faster, even though it was not part of the marked route. The ground was cracked and uneven, covered in thin white salt crusts that reflected the light almost painfully. I took a few photos out of habit, zooming in on a rusted piece of metal half buried in the dirt. When I looked closer through the lens, I thought I saw movement, just a quick flicker. But when I lowered the camera, the space was empty again. I reached a point where the GPS stopped responding entirely. The signal bar showed nothing, and every direction looked the same. Endless pale ground and the shimmer of heat in the distance. I checked my watch, realizing I had only a couple of hours before dark. That was when my fitness tracker buzzed, showing my heart rate climbing even though I was standing still. I laughed nervously, thinking it must be the heat or dehydration, but the beeping kept speeding up. It sounded almost like a countdown, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint in the wind, a soft, rhythmic click, too steady to be random. The air had turned cooler, but the silence grew heavier, thick enough that every breath seemed to echo. I started walking toward a ridge that looked familiar, convinced it would lead me back to the main route. My shadow stretched long and thin, distorted by the uneven ground. That was when I noticed something strange. Faint indentations in the dust ahead, too wide to be animal tracks, but not deep enough to be human footprints. They ran parallel for a few yards, then stopped abruptly as if whoever made them had just vanished mid-step. I crouched to look closer, running my fingers along the edges, but the ground felt unusually smooth, like glass warmed by the sun. When I stood back up, I caught a brief reflection from something about 30 feet away. It was small, metallic, and half buried near a cluster of dry brush. I walked toward it, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots the only thing breaking the stillness. The object turned out to be a weathered radio, old enough that the brand name had faded off. The antenna was missing and the battery cover was sealed shut with dried mud. I turned it over, and as I did, it gave a faint click, so quiet that I thought I imagined it. Then, almost immediately, the air seemed to change temperature, like a wave of cooler air rolling through without any wind to carry it. I remember glancing at my camera, thinking I should record it, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense that I was standing somewhere I was not supposed to be. The lens captured nothing unusual, just dry terrain and the horizon bleeding into pale sky. But the sound in the background caught my attention. It was faint but rhythmic, a pulse-like tapping that came and went in short bursts. I looked around for power lines or loose metal that could be vibrating, but there was nothing. The desert stretched empty in every direction, and I began to notice how unnatural the quiet felt, as though something had swallowed up every sound except my own breathing. When I decided to head back, the GPS on my phone flickered again before dying completely. The battery had been at 70% minutes earlier. I told myself I could find the car by using the sun's position, but the light had shifted oddly, flattening everything around me. Every direction looked the same, just colorless ground and dry shapes that blurred when I stared too long. My heart was racing again, harder this time, and my tracker buzzed once more. I turned off my camera, zipped it in the backpack, and started walking fast. I kept thinking I was retracing my steps, but after a while I realized I was walking toward a place I did not recognize at all. After what felt like an hour of walking, the landscape began to play tricks on my vision. The horizon shimmered, and shapes formed in the heat, distant and uncertain. I could have sworn I saw a fence line ahead, but when I approached, it dissolved into nothing but twisted roots and sand. I called out once just to hear my voice, but the sound didn't carry. It died a few feet away, swallowed by the dry air. The silence was so deep it almost rang in my ears. I remember thinking that if I stood perfectly still, the world might stop noticing me altogether. When I checked my watch again, it showed the same minute it had 20 minutes earlier. The second hand ticked once, then stopped. I tapped the glass, convinced it was stuck, but it didn't move. For a moment I had the strange impression that time itself had thinned somehow, stretching and stuttering like a bad recording. The pulse from the fitness tracker continued, erratic now, flashing red every few seconds. Then came that sound again, the faint metallic click exactly like the one from the radio. It was behind me this time, steady, deliberate, like someone testing a switch on and off. I turned slowly, scanning the empty expanse. Nothing moved, yet I felt the air shift again, cool, then warm, like breathing in and out. My throat was dry enough to ache. I wanted to sit down, but the thought of stopping made me uneasy, as though the ground itself might open if I stayed too still. I kept moving, trying to head west, judging by the fading light. I found myself counting my steps just to keep rhythm, whispering the numbers out loud so I would not forget the sound of my own voice. The landscape had no pattern anymore. I might as well have been walking in circles. Eventually, I spotted what looked like my own footprints leading back toward a low ridge. Relief hit me hard enough that I laughed under my breath. The tracks looked fresh, too clean to have been made hours ago, but when I followed them, they stopped abruptly next to a small clearing, an oval patch of flattened ground surrounded by brush. My backpack was sitting there, zipped perfectly shut, as if I had placed it down carefully and stepped away. My shoes were beside it, side by side, neatly aligned. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought someone was playing a cruel joke. I took a step closer, certain I must have dropped the backpack earlier without realizing it. But the straps were spotless, No dust, no sweat marks, nothing that suggested I had carried it through miles of heat. The shoes were the same way, lined up like they were on display. A shiver ran through me, not from cold but from the strange neatness of it. I reached down to touch the zipper, and the moment my fingers brushed the fabric, I heard that metallic click again, louder this time, right next to my ear. I spun around expecting to see someone, but the space was completely empty. Even the light looked different, dimmer, like twilight had come all at once. I grabbed the camera from the backpack and turned it on, hoping the lens would catch whatever I was missing. The viewfinder showed the same patch of desert I stood in, nothing more. Then, for half a second, a faint distortion crossed the screen, a blur shaped almost like a person standing in the distance. The moment I blinked, it was gone. I hit record anyway, panning slowly around, my breath shallow. Somewhere behind me, that clicking sound repeated, this time spaced out, mechanical, deliberate. It echoed once, twice, then stopped altogether. I remember whispering, "Hello?" and realizing my voice did not echo back. The sun had almost vanished when I finally saw the faint shimmer of my car's windshield far off on the horizon. Relief flooded through me. I stuffed everything into the backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking fast. Each step felt heavier than the last, like I was moving through invisible resistance. When I reached the spot where I thought the trail should reconnect, there was nothing, just unbroken desert. The sky had turned a strange shade of gray-blue, and I could not tell where the horizon ended. That was when the fitness tracker went silent. Its display froze, showing one last number flashing red before the screen went black. The final thing I remember is pressing the record button one more time, lifting the camera toward the empty land. The wind picked up for the first time that day, carrying a faint metallic hum that rose and fell like a signal trying to form words. The last frame I captured showed nothing but the cracked ground and dry brush swaying in rhythm. Then came that sound again, a single, clean click, and everything went dark. I work as a mechanic for a small auto shop just outside of Barstow, the kind of place where the wind never stops carrying sand across the parking lot. That afternoon was supposed to be simple. I had to deliver a replacement part to a client before dark, an alternator for an old pickup sitting on the other side of the desert. My boss had told me to stick to the main route, but there's always that temptation to shave an hour off the drive. When I saw the faded sign pointing toward Amboy Road, I figured it would be fine. The sun was still up, the air dry but bearable, and my truck had been running smooth all week. About halfway through the stretch, the heat began to build in that suffocating way that makes every sound sharper. The dashboard thermometer flickered past 110, and the horizon started to blur into that liquid shimmer you see above asphalt. I turned off the radio, just to listen to the hum of the engine. It had a faint metallic whine, one I hadn't noticed before. When I checked the gauge, the needle was creeping toward the red. I cursed under my breath, eased off the gas, and pulled over on the side of the road. When I lifted the hood, steam burst out like I'd opened an oven door. The radiator hissed and popped. I waited a few minutes, letting the heat roll off in waves before checking the coolant, bone dry. That didn't make sense. I'd checked it that morning. My phone had zero signal, but that didn't surprise me out there. The desert around Amboy Road stretches forever. No buildings, no signs of life except the occasional tumbleweed bouncing by like it had somewhere to be. A few miles ahead, I thought I saw something that looked like a billboard, just a dark rectangle standing out against the pale sand. It gave me a direction at least. I grabbed my water bottle and started walking, figuring I could reach it within half an hour. The air felt heavier with every step, like it was pressing down on my chest. My boots sank into the soft shoulder of the road, and the only sound I could hear was the crunch of gravel underfoot. That's when I noticed something strange. The billboard didn't seem to get any closer, no matter how far I walked. After about 20 minutes of walking, I realized I was sweating through my shirt, even though the sun had started to dip. The billboard looked warped now, like heat was bending its edges. My tongue felt dry, but I didn't want to waste water yet. Every time I stopped, the silence pressed against me. No wind, no insects, just the faint crackle of heat coming off the sand. I thought I heard a low hum somewhere ahead, maybe a generator or power line, but it faded when I turned my head. The horizon shimmered in all directions, and I started to lose any sense of how far I'd gone. When the ground began to slope downward, I realized the terrain wasn't as flat as it looked from the truck. The sand shifted to hard-packed dirt, scattered with sharp stones and metal scraps that looked half-buried. I saw something glinting near my boot and bent down, a rusted canteen, dented and dry. The surface around it had deep cracks, like the earth had been pulled apart and left that way. I started noticing more debris, an old tire rim, a shattered bottle, what might have been the edge of a sign. It hit me that this might have been part of a mining site once. The billboard wasn't real. It took me too long to admit that. As I got closer, the rectangle dissolved into nothing, just light playing tricks through layers of hot air. But beneath it, there was a dark pit, wide and jagged, as if the ground had caved in decades ago. The edges were lined with wooden beams blackened by time. My boots sent loose gravel tumbling into the hollow, and I heard the faint echo bounce back up much longer than I expected. Whatever was down there went deep. Standing on the edge, I felt an odd vibration under my feet. Not enough to be movement, but like the earth was holding its breath. I called out just to break the silence, but my voice came back warped, as if someone else had repeated it from below. For the first time, I wanted to turn back, but I couldn't find the direction I came from. The sun had dropped behind a ridge, and the desert looked identical in every direction. My truck should have been behind me, but all I could see was the faint line of tire marks leading in a half circle. I tried retracing my own steps, following the indentations my boots had left, but they curved in ways that made no sense. They looped and overlapped, like I had been walking in circles without realizing it. The air shimmered again, and for a second, I thought I saw the shape of my truck in the distance, its silver outline rippling on the horizon. I shouted, but the echo came back wrong, thinner this time, stretched out like someone whispering the last syllable of my name. The sound of it made my throat tighten, and I started walking faster, even though my legs felt heavier with each step. The ground around me changed color as the light faded, shades of red, brown, and almost purple blending together. When I glanced back, I couldn't find my own footprints anymore. They seemed to fade as soon as I moved away from them. My water bottle clanked against my leg, still full, but I didn't feel like drinking. My mouth was dry, yet the idea of swallowing anything made my chest tighten. I remember thinking how quiet everything was, how unnatural it felt to be surrounded by so much space and still feel trapped inside it. By the time the last trace of sunlight disappeared, the pit looked different. It wasn't just a hole in the ground anymore. It looked alive somehow. Shadows moved across it, shifting even though there was no wind. I stood there watching, convinced I saw something at the bottom. Small lights flickering like lanterns deep underground. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks, but a faint rhythm started rising from the pit, steady and low like the thump of machinery far below the surface. I turned away, but the sound didn't stop. I started walking again, this time not caring about direction. My only thought was to get away from that pit. The desert swallowed the light quickly, and soon I was moving under a sky crowded with stars that felt too close, too bright. The sand reflected their glow in a pale shimmer that made the landscape look unreal. At some point, I tripped over something half-buried, a steel beam maybe, and when I got up, my truck was there again. Same spot, same open hood. The air above it still wavered from heat, even though the night had turned cold. I walked around the truck twice, trying to make sense of it. The hood was still warm, and the keys were right there in the ignition. My footprints led away from it, a single winding trail that curved back in a perfect loop. For a moment I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd just gotten turned around in the heat and walked in circles until dark. But when I looked back toward the desert, the horizon flickered again, and I swore I saw that same dark shape where the pit had been, pulsing faintly in the distance like a heartbeat. I got inside the truck, locked the doors, and sat there until the first gray light started to rise. My throat burned, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the water bottle on the passenger seat. The silence outside was complete, not even a breeze to move the sand. I tried starting the engine, and it came to life without hesitation, as if nothing had happened. I drove slowly back toward town, following my own tire tracks until the asphalt appeared again. When I finally reached the main road, my hands were trembling on the wheel, though I didn't feel cold or afraid, just hollow, like something had drained out of me. When I made it back to the shop, my boss asked if I'd gotten lost. He said the rescue crew had been called after the client reported I never showed up. They'd found my truck the night before, hood still warm, doors unlocked, but nobody around. According to them, they'd searched until dawn, following my footprints in a huge circle less than a mile wide. I wanted to tell him that couldn't be right, that I'd walked for hours into the desert, but the words wouldn't come out. I just nodded, pretending I didn't remember much after the engine gave out. It has been years since that night, and I still can't explain what happened. Sometimes I drive that route again, staying on the main highway, and I catch myself glancing toward the sand where the mirage should have been. There's nothing there, not even the faint outline of a pit. But once, just before dusk, I thought I saw a shimmer. A rectangle standing still against the horizon. It looked exactly like that billboard I never reached. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving until I saw the lights of town again. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. December 23rd fell on a Monday that year, and my wife packed the minivan while I watched from the living room couch, wrapped in 2 blankets and sweating through a fever that had started 4 days earlier. Kayla and the kids were heading to her parents' place in Wisconsin, a 6-hour drive that I normally dreaded, but now desperately wished I could make. Our daughter Lily, just turned 7, pressed her face against the front window and waved at me with both hands before climbing into her booster seat. My son Owen, barely 5, blew me a kiss that made my chest ache worse than the congestion. The flu had hit me like a freight train the week before Christmas, the kind where your bones feel like they're filled with concrete, and every cough tears something loose in your lungs. Kayla kissed my forehead, told me to rest and drink fluids, and promised they'd FaceTime me on Christmas morning when Lily opened her presents. I watched the red taillights disappear down Crescent Road around 4 in the afternoon, and suddenly our 2-story colonial felt enormous and hollow. That first evening alone passed in a haze of NyQuil and bad television. I managed to heat up some soup around 8, shuffled to the bathroom twice, and fell asleep on the couch, because climbing the stairs to our bedroom felt like scaling Everest. The house creaked and settled the way old houses do when winter temperatures drop, and I barely registered any of it through my medicated fog. Our neighborhood in the suburbs outside of Milwaukee was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked during the day and waved at each other from their driveways. We had moved there 3 years earlier, right after Owen was born, trading our cramped apartment for a house with a backyard and a 2-car garage. The block was mostly families with young kids and a few retired couples, the sort of street where nothing interesting ever happened. That night, I remember thinking how peaceful the silence was without the kids running around, how the only sounds were the furnace clicking on and the occasional car passing outside. By 11, I had dragged myself upstairs to the master bedroom, taken another dose of cold medicine, and collapsed into bed with my phone on the nightstand. What woke me was a sound that my fever-addled brain tried to explain away as a dream. A heavy thump somewhere below, like a package being dropped on the front porch. Christmas Eve was the next day, and we had been getting deliveries all week, So my first thought was that some overnight driver was dropping off a late shipment. I squinted at my phone, 2:47 in the morning, and figured I would deal with it tomorrow. But then came another thump, this one different, more like weight shifting on wood, and then a third sound that made me sit up in bed despite every muscle in my body screaming in protest. It was voices. Muffled, low, but unmistakably human voices coming from somewhere outside the house. I told myself it was probably neighbors coming home late from a party, maybe struggling with their own holiday packages. The fever made everything feel distant and surreal, like watching a movie through a fogged window. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a moment, listening, my heart starting to beat faster despite my attempts to rationalize what I was hearing. The master bedroom sat at the back of the house, with 2 windows overlooking the backyard and the wooden fence that separated our property from the Nguyen's place behind us. I did not turn on any lights. Some instinct I cannot fully explain kept me in the dark as I moved toward the window. The blinds were partially open, the way Kayla always left them because she liked waking up to natural light. I pressed my face close to the glass and looked down into the yard, and what I saw made every symptom of my illness vanish in a single instant of pure, crystalline terror. 3 figures dressed in dark clothing were climbing over the back fence, one already dropping into our yard, while the other 2 straddled the top. They moved with practiced coordination, no wasted motion, no hesitation. One of them pulled out a flashlight and swept the beam across the back of our house, pausing on the sliding glass door that led to the kitchen. I pulled back from the window so fast I nearly tripped over the nightstand, my breath suddenly loud and ragged in the silent bedroom. These were not neighbors. These were not delivery drivers. These were men breaking into my home in the middle of the night, and I was completely alone. My phone was still on the nightstand, and I grabbed it with fingers that felt numb and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. I dialed 911 and pressed the phone to my ear, keeping my voice as low as physically possible when the dispatcher answered. I whispered our address, told her there were 3 men breaking into my house right now, that I was sick and alone and unarmed. She asked me to stay on the line and told me officers were being dispatched, but her voice sounded impossibly far away, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass breaking somewhere downstairs, followed by the scrape and click of the sliding door being forced open. They were inside. The dispatcher was saying something about staying hidden, about not confronting them, but I was already moving toward the bedroom closet because it was the only place I could think of. Our closet was a walk-in, not huge but deep enough that I could press myself into the back corner behind Kayla's winter coats. I slid the door shut as quietly as I could manage, leaving it open just a crack so I was not in complete darkness. From inside that closet I could hear everything with terrible clarity. Footsteps on the hardwood floors downstairs, heavy and unhurried, moving through the living room and into the kitchen. Then a voice, male, speaking just loud enough that the words drifted up through the heating vents that connected every room in the house. Clear the first floor fast, then upstairs. Families in Wisconsin until the 26th. I saw them pack the car. Another voice responded, younger sounding, almost eager. What about the alarm? The first voice laughed, a short, humorless sound. No alarm. These neighborhoods never have real security, just those fake signs in the front yard. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any sound, my whole body trembling not from fever now but from something far more primal. They knew. They had watched us. They had seen Kayla and the kids leave, had noted our habits, had probably driven past our house a dozen times over the past week waiting for this exact moment. This was not random. This was planned. The dispatcher was still on the line, her voice a tinny whisper from the phone I had pressed against my thigh to muffle any sound. I could hear her asking if I was still there, if I was safe, but I could not risk answering because the footsteps had reached the bottom of the stairs. There was a pause, a murmured conversation I could not make out, and then the creak of the first step. They were coming up. I had maybe 30 seconds before they reached the second floor, before they started opening doors, before they found the master bedroom and the closet where I was hiding like a child afraid of monsters. Except these monsters were real, and they were methodical, and I had nothing to defend myself with except a bottle of NyQuil and a box of tissues. The phone screen glowed faintly against my leg, and I watched the call timer tick upward, 4 minutes and 12 seconds since I had dialed. The dispatcher had said officers were on their way, but our suburb was not exactly a high-crime area. Response times could be 10 minutes, 15, maybe longer on a holiday week when half the force was on vacation. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and stopped. I heard one of them breathing, a thick, wet sound like he had a cold of his own, and then a flashlight beam swept under the crack of the closet door, moving left to right across the bedroom carpet. "Check the kids' rooms first," the older voice said, and the footsteps moved away down the hall toward Lily's room with its purple walls and stuffed animals. I heard the door open, heard someone rummaging through drawers, and then a different voice, the third man who had not spoken before, called out something about jewelry and a laptop. They were professionals. They knew exactly what they were looking for, knew which rooms to hit, knew how to move through a house quickly and efficiently. The closet suddenly felt impossibly small, the winter coats pressing against my back like hands trying to push me forward. I could smell Kayla's perfume on one of her jackets, a scent that usually comforted me, but now made me want to scream because it reminded me of everything I stood to lose if these men found me hiding in the dark. Then the bedroom door opened. The hinges made a soft whine that I had been meaning to fix for months, and now that tiny neglected chore felt like a death sentence announcing my location. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the bed with its rumpled sheets, across the nightstand with the half-empty glass of water and the bottle of cough syrup. I held my breath so completely that my lungs started to burn, my vision going spotty at the edges from lack of oxygen and pure concentrated fear. Footsteps crossed the carpet, moving toward the bathroom first. I heard the shower curtain being pulled back, the medicine cabinet opening and closing. "Nothing in here," the younger voice called out. "Check the closet," the older one responded from somewhere in the hallway, and I felt every muscle in my body lock up tight. This was it. There was nowhere else to hide, no escape route, no weapon within reach. I was going to be found by men who had broken into my home expecting it to be empty, and I had no idea what they would do when they discovered they were wrong. The closet door started to slide open, and in that moment I did something I still cannot fully explain. Maybe it was the fever, maybe it was some desperate survival instinct, but I started coughing. Not quietly, not trying to suppress it. I let loose with the worst, most wretched hacking cough I could produce, the kind that sounded like tuberculosis and pneumonia combined. The door stopped moving. I kept coughing, adding a wet gurgling sound that came naturally given how congested I actually was, and then I heard the younger voice say something sharp and panicked. "Someone's in there! Someone's sick in there!" There was a commotion in the hallway, whispered arguing, and then the older voice cut through with authority. "Leave it, we got enough, let's move." The closet door slid shut again, and I heard footsteps retreating fast down the hallway, down the stairs, and then the slam of the back door. I kept coughing even after they were gone, unable to stop now that I had started, my whole body convulsing with the effort as tears streamed down my face. The police arrived, 11 minutes after I had first dialed, which meant they missed the intruders by maybe 3 or 4 minutes. I was still in the closet when I heard sirens, still clutching my phone with the 911 call at 17 minutes, and counting. 2 officers came through the broken back door with their weapons drawn, calling out and identifying themselves, and I finally managed to croak out that I was upstairs, that I was the homeowner, that the men were gone. They found me sitting on the closet floor surrounded by winter coats, shaking so badly that one of them thought I was having a seizure. The paramedics they called checked my vitals and said my fever had spiked to 103, probably from the stress and adrenaline. They wanted to take me to the hospital, but I refused because I could not stand the thought of leaving my house empty again, even with police tape on the back door. An officer stayed with me until morning while detectives processed the scene, dusting for fingerprints and photographing the damage. They had taken my laptop, Kayla's jewelry box, some cash from my desk drawer, and Owen's piggy bank that had maybe $40 in quarters. I called Kayla at 6 in the morning and told her what happened, and she drove back that same day with the kids, cutting their trip short by 3 days. We installed a real security system the week after Christmas, cameras and motion sensors, and an alarm that connects directly to the police department. The detectives caught 2 of the 3 men about a month later. They had been running the same operation across 4 counties, targeting houses where families had visibly left for the holidays. The younger one, the one whose panic at my coughing probably saved my life, was only 19 years old. He told the police that they specifically looked for signs that homeowners were traveling. Cars loaded with luggage, piled up mail, dark windows at night. They had watched our house for a week before deciding it was safe. What they never counted on was a sick husband staying behind. I still think about that night sometimes, especially during the holidays when the house gets quiet and I hear sounds I cannot immediately explain. That closet is just a closet now, full of clothes and shoes and normal everyday things. But every time I open the door, I remember what it felt like to hide there in the dark, listening to strangers move through my home, waiting to be found. My coworkers used to joke that I was the last person who would ever get into trouble. Quiet, responsible, always the designated driver at happy hours. That was me at 24, fresh out of college and working my first real corporate job at an insurance firm in Richmond, Virginia. I had been there for about 18 months when the 2016 holiday season rolled around, and our manager Gloria booked a private room at this upscale Italian place downtown for our Christmas dinner. I remember spending an hour doing my makeup that night, wearing my nicest black dress, the pearl earrings my grandmother left me, and feeling like I had finally arrived somewhere in life. The restaurant had exposed brick walls, dim Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and this gorgeous marble bar that made you feel important just by standing near it. I was so focused on having a good time, on fitting in with people I admired, that I never once considered anything could go wrong. 9 years later, I still get a knot in my stomach every time office holiday parties come around, because what happened after that dinner changed the way I move through the world forever. The dinner itself was perfect, almost annoyingly so in retrospect. Our group of about 15 people laughed, exchanged white elephant gifts, and drank way too much red wine for a Wednesday night. Gloria, this fierce woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her hair, and a laugh that filled entire rooms, kept refilling my glass and telling embarrassing stories about difficult clients. By 10:30, most of us were tipsy and warm from the alcohol. That kind of buzzing happiness where everything feels soft around the edges. People started leaving in small groups around 11, calling Ubers and saying long goodbyes in the cold December air out front. I stayed until almost midnight talking to a guy from accounting named Peter, this tall redhead with a gap between his front teeth, who always made me laugh with his terrible puns. When I finally decided to leave, the temperature had dropped significantly, and a bitter wind was cutting through the street like a blade. Instead of walking around the block to where I had parked my car, I made a decision that still haunts me. I figured I would cut through the alley behind the restaurant to save myself 2 minutes in the freezing cold. The alley was darker than I expected. The back of the restaurant had a single floodlight above the kitchen door, but it only illuminated a small circle near the dumpsters, leaving the rest of the passage in deep shadow. I could see the glow of the street on the other end, maybe 50 feet away, and I told myself it was fine. My heels clicked against the wet pavement, echoing off the brick walls in a way that made me suddenly aware of how alone I was. I pulled my coat tighter and walked faster, my breath forming little clouds in front of my face. I was maybe 15 feet into the alley when I heard footsteps behind me. Quick, deliberate, closing the distance. Before I could even turn around, a hand clamped over my mouth from behind and another grabbed my wrist so hard I felt the bones grind together. Someone dragged me sideways, and my ankle twisted as I stumbled, one of my heels snapping clean off. I tried to scream, but the hand pressed harder, and I could taste leather and something metallic, like the person had been handling coins. They shoved me behind the dumpster, into a space that smelled like rotting food and stale grease. A man pressed me against the cold brick wall, his face inches from mine, and in the dim light I could make out a ski mask with holes cut for his eyes and mouth. He was breathing hard, and I could smell cigarettes and something sour on his breath. His grip on my wrist was crushing, and he kept his other hand firmly over my mouth. I heard another voice from the entrance of the alley, low and urgent. Another one from the office party, hurry before more come out. That sentence hit me like a punch to the chest. Another one. They had been waiting, watching us leave the restaurant one by one, picking off whoever wandered away from the group. This was not random. This was not bad luck. These men had planned this, had studied us through the window as we laughed and drank, knowing exactly what they were going to do when we stumbled out into the night. The man holding me yanked at my purse strap so hard it burned across my shoulder before snapping. I heard the contents spill somewhere on the ground, my lipstick rolling away, keys jingling against concrete. He shoved the purse at someone I could not see, and then his hands were on me again, pulling at my coat, patting my pockets. When his fingers found my phone in my jacket, he ripped it out and tossed it behind him. Then he saw my earrings, my grandmother's pearls. He reached for my ear and I did something I did not plan, something that came from a place of pure animal instinct. I bit down on the hand covering my mouth as hard as I could. I tasted blood, felt skin tear between my teeth, and the man screamed and jerked his hand away. For 1 second, maybe 2, his grip loosened and I twisted sideways and started to run. I made it 3 steps before something hard hit the back of my head and the world tilted sideways. I hit the ground on my hands and knees, my palms scraping against broken glass and gravel, pain shooting up my arms. Someone grabbed a fistful of my hair and pulled my head back. The man I had bitten was cursing, calling me names I will not repeat, and I could see blood dripping from his hand onto the pavement. The other one, the lookout, had come into the alley now, and he was younger than I expected. I caught a glimpse of acne scars on his chin below the edge of his mask. He kept looking back toward the street, nervous, bouncing on his feet. "Just get the jewelry and let's go," he hissed. "Someone's gonna come." The first man yanked my head back further and tore one earring out of my ear. The pain was blinding, white hot, and I felt blood running down my neck into my collar. I screamed then, a real scream that echoed off the walls, and the younger one panicked. He grabbed the first man's arm and pulled him toward the back of the alley. Leave it, we gotta go." They took off running, disappearing through a gap in a chain-link fence I had not even noticed was there. And suddenly I was alone, kneeling in garbage and broken glass, bleeding and shaking in the dark. I do not know how long I stayed there. It could have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. Time had become something fluid and unreliable. Eventually, I managed to get to my feet, using the dumpster to pull myself up, and I stumbled toward the street on one broken heel. My ear was throbbing, blood soaking into the collar of my dress, and I could feel something warm running down my scalp where I had been hit. When I reached the sidewalk, the world seemed too bright, too loud, even though the street was nearly empty. A couple walking their dogs saw me and the woman gasped, pulling out her phone immediately. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie. Mascara streaked down my face, blood on my neck and hands, my coat torn and dirty. The man took off his jacket and wrapped it around my shoulders, asking me questions I could barely process. Someone called 911. Someone else ran into the restaurant to get help. And then Gloria was there, her face pale and terrified, holding my hands and telling me I was going to be okay, that help was coming, that I was safe now. The police arrived before the ambulance. 2 officers, a man and a woman, and they asked me to describe what happened while we waited for the paramedics. I told them everything I could remember, the ski masks, the voices, the phrase about the office party. The female officer's expression changed when I mentioned that. She stepped away and spoke into her radio, and when she came back, she asked me the name of the restaurant and how many people had been at our dinner. I found out later what she had already known. I was the 3rd person attacked that night. A woman named Sandra from our marketing department had been mugged 2 blocks away around 11:15, walking to her car after saying goodbye to everyone. A man named Craig from IT had been jumped near the parking garage at 11:45, beaten badly enough to need stitches above his eye. 3 attacks in less than an hour, all targeting people leaving the same Christmas party. The paramedics loaded me into the ambulance as this information sank in, and I remember staring at the ceiling of that vehicle thinking that none of this felt real, that I would wake up tomorrow and it would all have been some terrible wine-fueled nightmare. At the hospital, a nurse cleaned the wound on my ear where the earring had been ripped out. She told me I was lucky. The lobe had torn but not completely, and it would heal with proper care. Lucky. The word made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. A doctor examined my head, said I had a mild concussion, and told me to have someone wake me every few hours through the night. Gloria stayed with me the whole time, sitting in that plastic chair by the bed, texting updates to our co-workers. Around 3 in the morning, a detective came to take my full statement. His name was Franklin, a tired-looking black man in his 50s with gray at his temples and kind eyes that had seen too much. He told me what the police had pieced together so far. A crew of at least 4 people had been targeting corporate holiday parties downtown for the past 2 weeks. They would scout restaurants with private event rooms, watch the guests through the windows, note the jewelry and expensive coats, and then wait outside for people to leave drunk and alone. They had hit 6 different parties before ours, but this was the first night they had gotten aggressive enough to physically hurt anyone. Something had escalated. Maybe they were getting desperate, or maybe they had just stopped caring about consequences. Detective Franklin asked me if I could identify any of them, and I told him about the acne scars on the younger one's chin, the cigarette smell on the other's breath, the specific way the first man had cursed when I bit him, a slight accent I could not quite place, maybe something Eastern European. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, nodding slowly. Before he left, he gave me his card and told me they would be in touch. I spent the rest of that night at Gloria's apartment because I could not stand the thought of being alone. Her husband made us tea and sat quietly in the living room, while Gloria helped me wash the blood out of my hair in her bathroom sink. I kept catching glimpses of myself in the mirror, the bruise forming on my temple, the bandage on my ear, the hollowness in my eyes, and I did not recognize the woman looking back at me. That confident girl who had done her makeup so carefully just hours before, who had felt so proud of her little black dress and her grandmother's pearls. She was gone. Something had been taken from me in that alley, something beyond the purse and the phone and the jewelry, and I did not know if I would ever get it back. The police caught them 11 days later. Detective Franklin called me on a Saturday morning to tell me that a pawn shop owner had recognized one of my grandmother's earrings, the one they had managed to take, from the description circulated to local businesses. The man who tried to sell it matched the details I had given: stocky build, cigarette smell, and when they pulled him in for questioning, they found bite marks on his hand that were still healing. He gave up his partners within hours trying to cut a deal. There were 5 of them in total, not 4. 2 brothers from Belarus who had overstayed their visas, a local guy with a long record of petty theft, and 2 younger men who served as lookouts and scouts. They had made over $40,000 in 3 weeks hitting holiday parties across the city, preying on people who were too drunk and happy to be cautious. The younger one with the acne scars, a 19-year-old named Victor, actually cried during his arrest and kept saying he never wanted anyone to get hurt. I did not feel sorry for him. I did not feel sorry for any of them. When the assistant district attorney called to tell me they had all taken plea deals and would be serving between 3 and 8 years depending on their level of involvement, I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not even realized was tight. It has been 9 years since that night, and I wish I could say I moved on completely, but that would be a lie. I still do not take shortcuts through alleys. I still get nervous at office parties, always positioning myself near the exit, always watching who comes and goes. The scar on my earlobe faded to a thin white line that most people never notice, but I see it every morning when I put on earrings. Never pearls, not anymore. Gloria retired 2 years ago and we still meet for coffee once a month. She never brings up that night unless I do first, but I know she thinks about it too. Last December, my company had its holiday dinner at a restaurant with valet parking and a security guard at the door, and I caught myself scanning the street outside, looking for anyone who might be watching us through the glass. I know that fear will probably never go away entirely, and I have made peace with that. What happened in that alley taught me something I carry with me now. The world is full of people waiting for you to let your guard down, and sometimes the most dangerous moments come wrapped in celebration and warmth. I survived. Sandra and Craig survived. And every December when the party invitations start arriving, I remind myself that survival is enough, that I am still here, still standing, still refusing to let those 5 minutes in the dark define the rest of my life. Corporate training conferences have a special way of draining your soul, and after 6 straight days of fluorescent lights and PowerPoint slides about logistics optimization, all I wanted was to get home before Christmas. My company had scheduled this regional meeting at our Spokane satellite office with zero consideration for the fact that some of us would need to cross mountain passes in the dead of winter to get back. I worked as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company based in Salt Lake City, one of those jobs you fall into after college when your art history degree turns out to be worth less than the paper it was printed on. My graduating class had scattered across the country chasing careers, and here I was 10 years later, spending more time on highways than in my own apartment. That Friday morning, I threw my overnight bag in the back of my Subaru Outback, grabbed the largest coffee the hotel lobby offered, and pointed myself toward Interstate 90 heading south. The December sky hung low and gray, pregnant with snow that the weather app swore would hold off until I was safely through the passes. I believed that little green checkmark more than my own gut, and that choice haunts me still. The first few hours passed without incident, just me and the hum of the heater. A true crime podcast filling the silence as I watched Montana unfold through my windshield. I stopped for gas outside Missoula, standing in a parking lot so cold that my breath crystallized the moment it left my lips, and texted my roommate Jenna that I should roll in around 9 or 10 that night. She responded with a row of Christmas tree emojis and promised her famous spiked hot cocoa would be waiting, the kind with cayenne pepper that warms you from the inside out. I remember smiling at my phone, picturing myself on our worn leather couch with a mug in my hands and my cat Oliver purring on my lap. The highway began its slow climb after Helena, the landscape transforming from flat brown farmland into dense pine forests blanketed in white. The mountains out there have a way of making you feel utterly insignificant, like civilization is just a thin veneer that nature tolerates, but could shrug off at any moment. I drove in silence after a while, the podcast abandoned, watching the trees blur past and the road narrow, completely unaware that within 2 hours I would be speeding through ice and darkness, while 3 men sprinted after my car with intentions I still cannot bring myself to fully imagine. The pass I needed to cross was called Lolo, and if you have ever driven it in winter, you know exactly why my stomach tightened as the elevation climbed. The road twists and curves along cliff edges, hugging the mountainside with guardrails that look like they were installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. Snow had been plowed to the sides, forming walls of dirty white that narrowed the lanes and limited visibility around every bend. I slowed to about 40 miles per hour, my knuckles pale against the steering wheel, watching for black ice on the asphalt. The few cars I had seen earlier seemed to have vanished, and I realized I had not passed another vehicle in at least 20 minutes. Cell service had dropped to nothing somewhere around the last switchback, my phone showing that useless no-service message that feels like a death sentence when you are alone in the mountains. I told myself this was fine, that thousands of people drove this pass every winter without incident, that I just needed to focus and take it slow. The shadows from the pines stretched long across the road as the afternoon light began its early winter fade, and I remember thinking how easy it would be to disappear out here, how long it might take anyone to find you. I came around a blind curve doing maybe 35, being extra cautious because the road had started to descend, and I could feel my tires losing grip in patches, when I saw the black SUV parked on the narrow shoulder about 200 feet ahead. Its hazard lights blinked orange against the gray afternoon, and I could see a man standing beside the driver door, waving both arms above his head in that universal gesture of distress. He wore a dark jacket and jeans, and even from that distance I could tell he was looking directly at my approaching headlights. My first instinct, the one drilled into me by years of being a woman who travels alone, was to keep driving. Do not stop for strangers on empty mountain roads, especially when your phone does not work and the nearest town is 40 minutes behind you. But then another thought crept in, the guilty one, the one that whispered about how I would feel reading a news story tomorrow about some poor man who froze to death on Lolo Pass while cars drove by without helping. The temperature outside was hovering around 15 degrees. If his car had broken down, if he had been out there for hours already, he could genuinely be in danger. Slowed down even more, my mind racing through options, and in that hesitation, I made the decision that nearly cost me everything. I pulled onto the shoulder about 30 feet behind the SUV, leaving my engine running and my headlights on because something in the back of my brain was still screaming at me to be careful. The man started walking toward my car immediately, his gait quick and purposeful despite the icy ground, and I noticed he was not shivering at all. That detail registered somewhere deep in my consciousness but did not fully surface until later. He was maybe mid-40s, with a weathered face and a thick beard that had patches of gray near his chin. I cracked my window about 2 inches, just enough to hear him but not enough for a hand to fit through, and called out asking what was wrong. He leaned down to my window level, close enough that I could see his breath fogging the glass, and said his battery had died and his phone was dead too. Asked if I had jumper cables or could give him a ride to the next town. His voice was calm, almost too calm for someone who had supposedly been stranded in freezing temperatures. I was about to tell him I had cables in my trunk when movement in my peripheral vision made every nerve in my body fire at once. 2 figures stepped out from behind the SUV, one from each side, and they were walking toward my car with a speed that had nothing to do with asking for help. The one on the left was carrying something long and metal, a crowbar or a tire iron. I could not tell which, and it did not matter. The one on the right was already at my back door before I could even process what was happening, and I heard the handle click as he yanked it hard. Thank God I had locked my doors automatically when I started driving that morning, a habit my father had drilled into me since I was 16. The man at my window changed completely in that instant, his calm demeanor evaporating into something predatory and cold. He shoved his arm through the gap I had left open, trying to reach the lock or grab my hair, I do not know which. I screamed something, probably just a raw sound of terror, and slammed my foot on the gas pedal without any thought beyond escape. My tires spun on the ice for one horrifying second where nothing happened, where the world seemed to pause and let me understand exactly how trapped I was. Then they caught, and my car lurched forward so violently that the man at my window stumbled backward and fell onto the road. I heard shouting behind me, angry male voices, but I did not look back. I just drove, fishtailing wildly on the frozen asphalt, my entire body trembling so hard I could barely keep the steering wheel straight. The next 10 minutes are a blur of adrenaline and terror that I have tried to piece together dozens of times since. I remember glancing at my rearview mirror and seeing the SUV's headlights flicker on, which meant they were coming after me. The road ahead was nothing but curves and ice and darkness creeping in from the edges of the forest, and I had to make a choice between driving fast enough to stay ahead of them and driving slow enough to not wrap my car around a tree. I pushed the speedometer to 50, then 55, feeling my back end slide with every turn while my headlights carved pale tunnels through the growing dusk. At some point I started crying, not sobbing but just tears streaming down my face while I whispered please, please, please like a prayer to no one. The SUV's headlights appeared behind me on a straight stretch, maybe a quarter mile back, and I watched them grow larger in my mirror as they closed the distance. They knew this road better than I did. That much was obvious. They knew exactly where to position themselves, exactly which curves would force a good person to stop, and they probably knew exactly how to run someone off a cliff and make it look like an accident. I do not know how long the chase lasted, whether it was 5 minutes or 15, but I remember the exact moment it ended. The road curved sharply to the left, and then opened up into a wider stretch where the trees pulled back from the shoulder. And sitting there like a mirage was a pickup truck with a camper shell parked at a scenic overlook. An older man in an orange hunting vest was standing outside the truck, a cigarette glowing between his fingers as he watched the last light fade over the mountains. I laid on my horn as I approached, a long, continuous blast that made him spin around in alarm, and I pulled off the road so fast that I nearly clipped his front bumper. The SUV behind me did not stop. It flew past the overlook doing at least 60, disappearing around the next curve without even tapping its brakes. I threw my car into park and just sat there, hyperventilating, unable to move as the hunter walked toward my window with a confused and concerned expression on his weathered face. When I finally managed to roll down my window and speak, what came out was barely coherent, just fragments about men and a crowbar and them trying to get into my car. He listened without interrupting, his eyes scanning the road behind me, and then he said 4 words that confirmed I had not imagined any of it. "You are not the first." His name was Gene, and he had lived in the area for over 30 years, hunting elk and mule deer in these mountains since before I was born. He told me to stay in my car with the doors locked while he grabbed his rifle from the truck, not because he thought they would come back, but because he wanted me to feel safe. Once he was standing beside my window with a scoped hunting rifle cradled in his arms, he explained what he knew. There had been 4 other incidents on this stretch of road in the past 2 months, all of them following the same pattern. A black SUV with hazard lights, a man waving for help, and then multiple attackers emerging once someone stopped. 2 of the victims had been carjacked and left stranded in the freezing cold. One of them a mother with 2 kids in the back seat who had to walk 3 miles in the snow before finding help. Another victim, a man traveling alone, had been beaten badly when he tried to fight back, his wallet and phone stolen, his car taken and later found burned out on a logging road. The police knew about it, Gene said, but the passes covered multiple jurisdictions, and the attackers never stayed in one spot long enough to be caught. They picked blind curves where drivers had to slow down, places where guilt would override caution, where the human instinct to help someone in trouble became a trap. I sat in my car at that overlook for almost an hour, waiting for my hands to stop trembling enough to drive. Gene refused to leave until he was sure I was okay, standing guard with his rifle while the temperature dropped and stars began to appear in the darkening sky above us. He let me use his satellite phone to call the county sheriff, and I gave a statement right there on the side of the road, describing the 3 men, the SUV, the license plate I had not thought to memorize because I was too busy trying not to die. The deputy on the phone sounded tired but not surprised, and he confirmed what Gene had told me. This crew had been hitting the passes all winter, moving between locations, always targeting solo drivers who looked like they might stop for someone in distress. They asked if I wanted to press charges if they caught them, and I almost laughed at the question. Of course I did. These men had turned basic human decency into a weapon, had exploited the part of us that wants to help strangers, and they had almost certainly done worse things to other people than what they tried to do to me. Before he hung up, the deputy told me something I have never forgotten. He said the woman with the 2 kids, the one who had been carjacked, she only stopped because her son had pointed at the man waving and asked why no one was helping him. She told the police she could not drive past after that, could not let her children see her ignore someone who needed help. Gene followed me down the mountain that night, his headlights a steady presence in my rearview mirror for the next 40 miles until we reached a town with cell service and a gas station, bright enough to feel like civilization again. I hugged him in the parking lot, this stranger with a rifle and a cigarette habit who had probably saved my life just by being in the right place at the right time, and he told me to drive safe and stay smart. I made it home to Salt Lake City around midnight, 6 hours later than I had planned, and Jenna was still awake waiting for me with that spiked hot cocoa she had promised. I did not tell her what happened until the next morning because I could not find the words that night, could only sit on the couch with Oliver purring against my chest and stare at the Christmas tree lights blinking in the corner of our living room. She cried when I told her. I cried too, not from fear anymore, but from the strange delayed realization of how close I had come to becoming one of those stories people share around campfires, one of those unsolved mysteries that haunts a stretch of highway forever. 3 weeks later, I got a call from the sheriff's office telling me they had caught the men responsible. An off-duty state trooper had spotted the SUV setting up on a different pass and called it in, and when they ran the plates, it matched a vehicle reported stolen 2 states away. All 3 of them had warrants, long histories of robbery and assault, and one of them was wanted in connection with a missing persons case from the previous spring that was still open. I still drive through mountains when I have to, but something fundamental changed in me after that day on Lolo Pass. I keep my doors locked and my windows up. I never stop for strangers, no matter how guilty it makes me feel, and I carry a satellite communicator in my glove box now for emergencies. Sometimes I wonder about the person they were waiting for after me, whether anyone else stopped that evening before the sun went down completely, whether someone out there was not as lucky as I was. I think about that mother and her kids walking through the snow, about the man who got beaten for trying to fight back, about all the people whose basic goodness was weaponized against them by men who saw compassion as nothing more than opportunity. The worst part is not the fear that lingers, though that is bad enough. The worst part is knowing that a small piece of my faith in humanity got left behind on that frozen road, and I am not sure I will ever get it back. I used to be the kind of person who stopped to help strangers. Now I am the kind of person who drives past and hates herself for it. And every time I see someone on the side of the road with their hazard lights on, waving for help, I feel that war inside me all over again. The guilt pulling one way and the memory of those 3 men pulling the other. And I press the gas pedal a little harder and whisper an apology to whoever they are, real or not, and I keep driving. My buddy Corey and I had been sneaking through the Norfolk Southern freight yard since middle school. By December of 2018, we had graduated from Eastbrook High about 6 months prior and were both stuck in that weird limbo between teenage freedom and actual adulthood, working part-time jobs and figuring out what came next. The yard sat on the edge of our town in eastern Tennessee, a sprawling maze of rusted tracks and forgotten rail cars that nobody seemed to care about anymore. We used it as a shortcut to get from the warehouse district where Corey worked to my neighborhood on the other side. It shaved about 20 minutes off the walk compared to going around on the main roads. That particular night, the first Saturday of December, Corey had finished his shift around 11 and texted me to meet him at our usual spot near the old signal tower. The temperature had dropped to maybe 30 degrees, and our breath came out in thick clouds as we walked between the long rows of freight containers. Holiday lights from the shopping center about a mile away cast this faint orange glow over everything, making the yard look almost peaceful in a strange way. We were maybe halfway through, passing a section where they kept the older boxcars that rarely moved, when Corey grabbed my sleeve and pulled me down. At first I thought he was messing around, but then I heard it too. Voices carrying across the cold air, way too close for comfort. This was unusual because the yard security rarely patrolled this deep, and the homeless folks who sometimes sheltered in the empty cars never talked that loud. We crouched low and duck-walked between 2 rusty grain hoppers, pressing ourselves against the cold metal wheels. From there, we could see a clearing about 50 yards ahead where a string of boxcars sat on a side track. 3 trucks were parked beside them, big unmarked panel vans with their headlights off but engines running. I counted at least 8 figures moving around, all wearing dark clothes and what looked like ski masks or balaclavas. My first thought was that we had stumbled onto some kind of drug deal, which would have been bad enough. But then the side door of one of the boxcars slid open, and everything I understood about the world shifted in a way I still cannot fully explain. 2 men climbed into the boxcar while a third held a flashlight from outside. The beam swept across the interior, and I saw them. People, maybe 6 or 7 of them, slumped against the walls like discarded mannequins. They were dressed in thin clothes completely wrong for December weather, and none of them were moving on their own. One by one, the men started dragging them out, carrying them like sacks of grain toward the waiting vans. Corey's hand found my arm in the dark, his fingers digging in so hard I knew there would be bruises later. We both understood immediately that this was not a drug deal. These were human beings being loaded into vehicles against their will, and the way their heads lolled and their limbs hung limp told me they had been drugged or sedated somehow. I remember the cold metal of the railcar wheel pressing into my back, the smell of diesel and rust, and this horrible feeling of helplessness spreading through my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to call someone, to do something, but my body refused to cooperate. The men worked fast and efficient like they had done this many times before. They communicated in short bursts, hand signals and whispered commands in a language I could not identify. One of them kept checking his phone, the screen glow briefly illuminating a face that looked weathered and impatient. A woman was passed from the boxcar to the ground, and I noticed her feet were bare despite the freezing temperature. Her hair hung over her face in tangled clumps, and her arms showed dark marks that could have been bruises or dirt. It was hard to tell from where we hid. By now, they had transferred maybe 5 people into the first van, stacking them inside with zero regard for comfort or dignity. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, that I had fallen asleep at home and this was some kind of nightmare fueled by too many crime documentaries. But the cold was too real, the sounds too sharp, the fear too immediate. This was happening 20 feet away from us, and all Corey and I could do was watch and pray they did not look in our direction. That is when one of them woke up. A young guy, maybe around our age or a little older, suddenly jerked his head up as 2 men were carrying him toward the second van. His eyes went wide, and for a split second he seemed completely disoriented. Then pure animal terror took over. He thrashed so hard that he slipped from their grip and hit the gravel on his hands and knees. The men shouted, and the young guy scrambled to his feet and started running. He made it maybe 15 feet before one of the masked figures caught up to him, tackling him from behind with a brutal efficiency that made my stomach turn. I heard the impact, this wet thud of bodies hitting frozen ground, followed by muffled screaming as they pinned him down. Another man jogged over carrying what looked like a syringe, and within seconds the screaming stopped. They picked him up again, limp as before, and continued loading him into the van like nothing had happened. The whole incident lasted maybe 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds burned themselves into my memory with perfect clarity. Corey was breathing so fast I thought he might pass out. I pressed my hand over his mouth, not to silence him, but to ground him somehow, to remind him that we needed to stay invisible. My own heart was slamming against my ribs like it wanted to escape my chest. The young man who had tried to run, I kept seeing his face in that brief moment of consciousness, the way recognition and horror had flooded his features simultaneously. He knew exactly what was happening to him. He knew he was being taken somewhere terrible, and his body had summoned every last ounce of strength to fight back. And it had not mattered. They had caught him in seconds, sedated him again, and now he was just another unconscious body in the back of a van. I thought about my phone, still in my jacket pocket, and how I should be recording this or calling 911. But my brain kept replaying what they had done to that kid, how fast and how ruthless, and I understood with horrible certainty that if they found us hiding here, we would end up in one of those vans too. The whole operation took maybe 20 minutes from when we first hid to when the last van door slammed shut. One of the men walked around the boxcar with a flashlight, checking the ground and the surrounding area. For one terrible moment, the beam swept toward the grain hoppers where we crouched, and I felt Corey stop breathing entirely. The light passed over us without pausing, but I swear it grazed the edge of my sneaker. Then the man turned back, said something to his companions, and climbed into the passenger seat of the lead van. The engines revved, and all 3 vehicles pulled away slowly, their headlights still off as they navigated through the freight yard toward a service road on the far end. We did not move. We stayed pressed against those cold wheels for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 10 minutes, waiting to make sure they were truly gone and not circling back. The silence that followed their departure was somehow worse than the sounds of what we had witnessed. A heavy, accusatory quiet that seemed to ask why we had not done anything to help. When we finally crawled out from our hiding spot, my legs had gone numb from crouching so long in the cold. Corey vomited against the side of a rail car, this raw heaving sound that echoed across the empty yard. I stood there watching him, my mind still trying to process what had just happened. Neither of us spoke as we made our way home, taking a different route that kept us far from the section where the transfer had occurred. I kept looking behind us, checking shadows, listening for engines. Every car that passed on the main road made me flinch. When I finally got home around 1 in the morning, my mom was asleep and the house was dark. I went straight to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and stared at the wall for maybe 2 hours. I could not sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that young man trying to run, saw him hit the ground, saw the syringe. I knew I needed to tell someone, but I had no idea how to explain what we had seen without putting ourselves in danger. Corey called me the next morning, his voice hoarse and shaky. He had not slept either. We talked in circles for almost an hour, going back and forth about what to do. Part of me wanted to go straight to the police, tell them everything, and let them handle it. But Corey pointed out that we had been trespassing when we saw it, that we had no proof, no photos, no license plates, just the word of 2 teenagers who had been cutting through private property at midnight. And there was something else neither of us wanted to say out loud. If these people were organized enough to move human beings through a freight yard like cargo, they were probably organized enough to find out who reported them. We decided to wait a few days, see if anything came up in the news, and then figure out our next move. It was a coward's decision, and I knew it even then. But fear has a way of making cowardice feel like common sense. 4 days later, it was all over the local news. The county sheriff held a press conference announcing that 7 people had been reported missing over the past 2 weeks, all from small towns within a 100-mile radius. Most of them were undocumented immigrants, people who had come looking for work and had no family nearby to notice when they vanished. But one of them was a kid named Marco Delgado, 19 years old, who had been a senior at Eastbrook High the year before Corey and I graduated. I remembered him vaguely. A quiet guy who played trumpet in the marching band and always wore this beat-up denim jacket with patches sewn on the sleeves. When they showed his photo on the news, my entire body went cold. It was him. The young man who had woken up, who had tried to run, who had been tackled and sedated right in front of us. I recognized his face instantly, the shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead. Marco Delgado had been 15 feet away from me, fighting for his life, and I had done nothing but hide. That same night, Corey and I went to the police station together. We told them everything: the freight yard, the boxcars, the vans, the masked men, Marco trying to escape. The detective who interviewed us, a tired-looking woman named Russo, listened without interrupting and took notes in a small spiral notebook. She asked us to describe the men, the vehicles, anything we could remember about markings or sounds or smells. We gave her every detail we could recall, which turned out to be a lot more than I expected. Trauma has a way of burning things into your brain whether you want it to or not. When we finished, Detective Russo told us we had done the right thing by coming forward, that our information could help them piece together a larger investigation already underway. She also warned us not to discuss what we had seen with anyone else, not to go back to the freight yard, and to call her directly if we noticed anything unusual. The way she said that last part, if we noticed anything unusual, made it clear that she understood the kind of people we were dealing with, and that our safety was not guaranteed just because we had talked to the cops. The investigation took months, and we were not told much about how it progressed. What I know came from news reports and a brief follow-up meeting with Detective Russo about 3 months later. Federal agents had gotten involved, tracing the trafficking ring across 4 states. They made arrests in Georgia and North Carolina, shutting down a network that had been operating for at least 2 years. Some of the victims were recovered alive, found in labor camps and illegal operations scattered across the Southeast. But Marco Delgado was not among them. His case remains open, listed as a missing person with no confirmed status. I think about him more often than I probably should. That brief moment when he woke up, when he fought back, when he almost made it. I wonder if things would have been different if Corey and I had called 911 right then, if we had been braver or smarter or less afraid. I will never know the answer to that, and I have learned to live with the weight of not knowing. What I do know is that some nights, especially in early December when the air gets cold and sharp, I still hear the sound of engines idling in the dark, and I remember what it felt like to witness something terrible and do nothing at all. Syracuse gets dark early in winter, and I mean dark. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the sky already looks like someone pulled a curtain over the whole city, streetlights flickering on while most people are still finishing their shifts. I worked at a warehouse distribution center on Lakeview Road, sorting packages and loading trucks until my back screamed for mercy, and every evening I walked 6 blocks to catch the 547 bus on Caldwell Avenue. The stop itself was nothing special, just a metal shelter with a cracked plastic bench, wedged between an abandoned dry cleaner and a storage facility surrounded by chain-link fence. Most of my coworkers had cars, waving goodbye from the parking lot while I zipped up my jacket and started the walk. Having graduated high school back in 2011, I always thought my life would look different by now. But there I was, riding public transit in the freezing cold, saving every dollar for an apartment with radiators that clanked and groaned like something was trapped inside the walls. I first noticed the car on a Wednesday, the first week of that month. A dark blue sedan, older model, maybe a Ford Taurus or something similar, parked across the street from the bus shelter with its engine off. Someone sat behind the wheel, just a shape against the faint glow of a phone screen. I barely registered it at first. People wait and parked cars all the time for 100 different reasons. Picking up family members, killing time, avoiding conversations at home. I checked the transit app on my phone and saw 7 minutes until arrival, so I stamped my feet to keep warm and watched my breath form little clouds that vanished into the cold air. When I looked up again, the silhouette inside the sedan had shifted. The person was no longer looking at their phone. Their head was turned toward the bus shelter, toward me, just sitting there motionless behind the glass. A delivery truck rumbled past and blocked my view for a moment, and when it cleared, nothing had changed. Same car, same figure, same unsettling stillness. I told myself it was nothing, and got on the bus when it arrived, forgetting about the whole thing before I even reached my stop. Thursday came and went without incident, mostly because I had to stay late for inventory, and missed my usual bus by almost an hour. By the time I reached Caldwell Avenue, the street was emptier than usual, the cold keeping everyone indoors, and the sedan was nowhere in sight. I remember feeling relieved without fully understanding why, like some part of my brain had flagged that car as a problem even though I had consciously dismissed it. Friday was different. I left work at my normal time, walked the same 6 blocks, and there it was again. Parked in the exact same spot across the street. Same dark blue sedan, same tinted windows, same figure behind the wheel. This time the engine was running, a thin trail of exhaust curling up into the frozen air, and the headlights were off even though the sun had already set. I stood under the bus shelter and pretended to scroll through my phone, but my eyes kept drifting back to that car. The figure inside did not move, did not check their phone, did not do anything except sit there facing my direction. 5 minutes passed, then 6. I could feel my pulse in my throat, which sounds dramatic, but you have to understand how isolated that bus stop was. No pedestrians, no other cars, just me and that sedan, and the buzz of a failing streetlight above my head. The bus finally arrived and I climbed on fast, tapping my transit card without looking back. I found a seat near the middle and glanced out the window as we pulled away from the curb. The sedan had not moved. But right before we turned the corner, I saw something that made my chest tight. The driver's side door had cracked open, just a few inches, like whoever was inside had been about to get out. The interior light did not turn on, which meant they had disabled it, and that detail stuck with me for the rest of the night. Why would someone disable their dome light unless they did not want to be seen? I told myself I was being paranoid, that I watched too many crime documentaries, that this was just some random person with a broken car light. But when I got home to my apartment, I locked the deadbolt and the chain, something I had not done in months. I even pushed my small kitchen table against the door, feeling ridiculous the whole time but unable to stop myself. That night I barely slept, staring at the ceiling and listening to the radiator clank, while my mind replayed the image of that door cracking open in the darkness. Saturday and Sunday offered a break from the routine, and I spent most of the weekend convincing myself that I had exaggerated the whole situation. By Monday morning, the fear had faded into something more like embarrassment. I even laughed about it while making coffee, shaking my head at how easily I had let my imagination spiral out of control. Just some guy waiting for someone, probably annoyed that I kept staring at his car like a paranoid freak. I went to work with a lighter mood, joking around with my coworker April during our lunch break, telling her about the creepy sedan as if it were a funny story instead of something that had kept me awake for 2 nights. She laughed and said I had been watching too much true crime, which is exactly what I needed to hear. The day passed quickly, and by the time 5 o'clock rolled around, I had almost completely forgotten about the whole thing. Almost. Because when I stepped outside the warehouse and started walking toward Caldwell Avenue, I felt a small knot form in my stomach, a tension I could not fully explain. The sun was already gone, the sky a deep purple bleeding into black, and the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since morning. I saw the sedan before I even reached the bus stop. Same spot, same position, same dark blue paint catching the glow of the distant streetlight. My steps slowed without me deciding to slow them, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. The engine was running again, that thin wisp of exhaust floating up into the cold, and this time I noticed something new. The passenger side window was down about 2 inches, despite the freezing temperature outside. I kept walking because stopping felt worse somehow, like it would confirm that I was afraid, that I had a reason to be afraid. When I reached the shelter, I did not sit on the cracked plastic bench. I stood near the edge closest to the street, positioning myself where I could see the sedan clearly and where the bus would block me from view as soon as it arrived. The figure behind the wheel was there, same as before, just a dark shape that never seemed to move. But then something changed. A sound cut through the quiet, faint but unmistakable. A car door opening. Not all the way, just that initial click and creak of hinges. I looked directly at the sedan and saw the driver's side door push outward a few inches, then stop. Whoever was inside was testing something, maybe checking if I would react, maybe waiting to see if anyone else was around. I pulled out my phone and pretended to make a call, holding it to my ear and speaking to no one on the other end. I said things like, "Yeah, I'm at the bus stop now, and okay, see you in a few minutes," hoping that whoever sat in that sedan would hear me, would think someone was expecting me, would decide I was not worth the risk. The door stayed cracked open the entire time, neither closing nor opening further, and I could feel eyes on me even though I could not see them through the tinted glass. My heart was pounding so hard I worried the person might somehow hear it across the street. 2 minutes until the bus, according to my app. I kept the fake conversation going, laughing at nothing, nodding along to silence, doing everything I could to seem like a person with connections, with people who would notice if something happened to me. A car drove past on Caldwell Avenue, and the sedan door clicked shut, fast and quiet, like a reflex. I watched the blue car sit there motionless again, engine still running, and I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not random. This was not coincidence. Someone had been watching me, learning my schedule, waiting for the right moment when the street was empty enough and the darkness thick enough to do whatever they were planning to do. The bus arrived and I practically threw myself through the doors, scanning my card and walking straight to the back where I could see out the rear window. As we pulled away, I watched the sedan. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the headlights flicked on, and the car slowly pulled out of its parking spot. It did not follow the bus, not exactly, but it drove in the same direction, turning left where we turned left, maintaining a distance of about half a block. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see the license plate. But the angle was wrong and the streetlights too dim. The sedan followed for 3 more blocks before it turned off onto a side street and disappeared. I sat back in my seat, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. When I got off at my usual stop, I did not walk straight home. Instead, I went into the convenience store on the corner and stayed there for 20 minutes, pretending to browse the aisles while watching the street through the window. No blue sedan, no one suspicious. Just the normal flow of evening traffic and pedestrians bundled up against the cold. I bought a bag of chips I did not want and finally walked home, checking behind me every few steps until I reached my building. That night I called my older brother Jeff, who lived about 40 minutes away in a suburb outside the city. He worked as an electrician and had that practical, no-nonsense attitude that made me feel stupid for even bringing it up. But I told him everything anyway: the sedan, the figure behind the wheel, the door cracking open, the way the car had followed the bus. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished, which surprised me because I expected him to tell me I was overreacting. Instead, he asked me specific questions. What color was the car exactly? Did I notice any dents or stickers or anything distinctive? What time did I usually get to the bus stop? Had I noticed anyone else being watched? I answered as best I could, and when I finished, he told me to start taking pictures. Document everything, he said. Get the license plate if I could. And most importantly, he told me to call the police and file a report, even if they could not do anything right away. Having something on record mattered, he explained, in case things escalated. I promised I would, and after we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling a strange mix of validation and terror. My brother had taken me seriously, which meant this was serious, which meant I was not imagining the danger I felt every time I stood at that bus stop alone in the dark. I called the non-emergency police line the next morning before work and explained the situation to an officer who sounded tired, but not dismissive. She took down the details, the location, the description of the car, the times I had seen it, and told me they would make a note in their system. She also suggested I vary my routine if possible, take a different bus, get picked up by someone, avoid being alone at that stop during the evening hours. I thanked her and hung up, feeling slightly better but also frustrated. Vary my routine. Easy to say when you have options, when you have a car or flexible hours or someone who can drive you. I had none of those things. My shift ended at 5 every day. The 5:47 was the only bus that got me home at a reasonable hour, and asking Jeff to pick me up every evening was not realistic. So I went to work, did my job, and when 5 o'clock came, I walked toward Caldwell Avenue with my phone already in my hand, camera app open, heart beating faster with every step. The sedan was there. Same spot, same silence. But this time, I was ready. I raised my phone and took 3 pictures in quick succession, zooming in on the license plate as much as I could without the image turning into a blurry mess. The figure inside the car must have noticed because the sedan suddenly pulled forward, not fast but deliberate, rolling out of the parking spot and down the street away from me. I kept taking pictures as it moved, capturing the rear of the vehicle, the shape of the taillights, anything that might help identify it later. My hands were steady even though everything inside me was screaming. The car turned right at the end of the block and vanished from sight, and I stood there under the bus shelter feeling like I had won something small but important. I had proof now. I had evidence that this was real, that someone had been watching me, that I was not crazy. When I got home, I emailed the photos to myself, saved them to my cloud storage, and sent copies to Jeff along with a message explaining what happened. He replied within minutes telling me to send everything to the police as well, which I did. The officer I had spoken to earlier called me back that evening and said they would run the plates and see what came up. She sounded more interested now, more alert, and she asked if I could come into the station the next day to give a formal statement. I agreed without hesitation. Wednesday morning I went to the police station before my shift and sat across from a detective named Howell, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. She showed me a photograph on her computer screen and asked if I recognized the vehicle. It was the blue sedan, no question, and I told her so immediately. She nodded and then told me something that made the room feel smaller. The car belonged to a man named Ronald Pratt, 47 years old. No permanent address, with a record that included assault, harassment, and a previous arrest for attempted abduction in another state 8 years ago. He had been released on parole 2 years prior and had recently been spotted in multiple locations around the city, always near bus stops, always during the early evening hours when the sun went down and the streets emptied out. I was not his only target, she explained. 3 other people had filed similar reports over the past month, all describing the same car, the same behavior, the same feeling of being watched and tested. The detective thanked me for coming forward and for the photos, which had given them the clearest image of his plates they had received so far. She told me they were actively looking for him now, and she advised me to stay vigilant until they made an arrest. For the next 4 days, Jeff picked me up after work. He would pull into the warehouse parking lot at 5:15, and I would climb into his truck and feel something close to normal for the 20 minutes it took him to drop me home. I hated needing help, hated feeling like I could not handle my own life. But I also knew that pride was not worth dying over. The bus stop on Caldwell Avenue stayed empty those evenings, at least from what I could see as we drove past. No blue sedan, no figure watching from behind tinted glass. Maybe Pratt had moved on to another part of the city. Maybe he knew the police were closing in and decided to lay low. I checked the local news obsessively, scrolling through articles on my phone during lunch breaks and before bed, waiting for something, anything that would tell me this nightmare was over. On Sunday night, I finally found it. A short article buried in the crime section reported that a man had been arrested near a bus stop on the east side of Syracuse after a witness called 911 to report suspicious behavior. The suspect, identified as Ronald Pratt, was taken into custody without incident and was being held on multiple charges including stalking, harassment, and violation of parole. The article mentioned that police believed he was connected to a string of incidents targeting individuals at isolated transit stops throughout the city during the early weeks of December. I read that article probably 15 times before I let myself believe it was real. Jeff called me that night after seeing the same news, and neither of us said much, just sat on the phone in silence for a while, breathing, processing. I went back to taking the bus the following Monday. Same route, same time, same cracked plastic bench under the flickering streetlight. The sedan was gone. The parking spot across the street sat empty, just a patch of asphalt where something terrible had almost happened but did not. I still think about those evenings sometimes, standing alone in the cold while someone watched me from behind dark glass, calculating, waiting. I think about how easily things could have gone differently, how one night without witnesses or one delayed bus might have changed everything. People always say to trust your instincts, and I used to roll my eyes at that kind of advice, but not anymore. My body knew something was wrong before my brain caught up, and the only reason I am writing this now instead of being another name in a news article is because I listened. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything. Tell someone. Do not let anyone make you feel stupid for being afraid. Fear kept me alive, and I will never apologize for that. Divorce has a way of making you crave silence. After 18 months of lawyers, arguments, and dividing everything from furniture to friendships, the idea of spending Christmas week completely alone felt less like loneliness and more like a reward. My co-worker Denise practically begged me to join her church potluck, and my landlord even mentioned a community dinner at the recreation center, but I turned down every invitation without a second thought. The townhouse complex where I lived sat on the outskirts of Tucson, one of those newer developments where every unit looked identical. Beige stucco walls, terracotta roof tiles, and a tiny backyard barely big enough for a grill and 2 lawn chairs. My place was the last unit on the east side, which meant I only shared one wall with my neighbor, an elderly man named Howard, who spent winters visiting his daughter in Seattle. His place had been dark and empty since early December. The unit across the small parking lot belonged to a young couple who had loaded up their SUV on the 22nd and driven off to spend the holidays with family somewhere in Texas. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, I was essentially alone in my little corner of the development, and that suited me just fine. The first 2 days of my vacation passed exactly as I had planned. Lazy mornings, long baths, and enough chocolate to put myself into a pleasant sugar coma. My graduating class from northern Arizona had scattered across the country years ago, so there was nobody local expecting me anywhere, nobody checking in, nobody wondering what I was doing at any given moment. December 23rd fell on a Monday that year, and I had taken the entire week off from my job at the insurance agency downtown. The main cluster of townhouses sat about 200 feet away from my unit, separated by a row of decorative desert landscaping and a curved walking path. I could see their Christmas lights twinkling in the distance from my kitchen window, but they felt miles away from my quiet little corner. That night, Christmas Eve, I made myself a simple dinner of pasta and garlic bread, poured a generous glass of Merlot, and settled onto my couch to watch some cooking competition show. The temperature outside had dropped into the low 40s, which counts as freezing by Arizona standards, and I remember feeling grateful for my thick wool socks and the blanket draped across my lap. The house was warm, the wine was good, and for the first time in almost 2 years, I felt something close to peace. The cooking show had just ended, and I was debating whether to open a second bottle of wine or call it an early night when I noticed the living room get slightly darker. It took me a moment to realize what had changed. The soft glow from my outdoor Christmas lights, the ones I had strung along the front porch railing, had disappeared. I glanced at the clock on my cable box and saw it was just past midnight. Officially Christmas Day now. My first thought was that the timer had malfunctioned, but I distinctly remembered setting it to stay on until 2 in the morning. I figured a fuse must have blown, which would not have surprised me given how old the electrical panel in these townhouses was. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept in my kitchen junk drawer and headed toward the front door, already mentally cursing the inconvenience of having to dig through the utility closet in the dark. But as I passed by the front window, I stopped. Through the gap between my living room blinds, I could see the parking lot bathed in the pale yellow glow of the complex street lamp, and crossing through that light, moving slowly along the front of my townhouse, was a shadow. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone from the main cluster of townhouses was taking a late-night walk, or perhaps a neighbor I did not know had come home for the holiday after all. But the shadow stopped directly in front of my window. Just stood there, a dark silhouette against the faint light, completely motionless. I could not make out any features through the blinds, just the general shape of a person, tall and broad-shouldered, facing my unit. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I backed away from the window slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, and pressed myself against the wall next to my bookshelf. The rational part of my mind kept insisting there had to be an innocent explanation, that I was overreacting because of the wine and the late hour, and the fact that I had been watching too many true crime documentaries lately. But something deep in my gut, some ancient instinct that exists in all of us, was screaming at me that this was wrong. I stood there in the darkness of my living room, barely breathing, watching that shadow through the thin gaps in my blinds, waiting for it to move, to leave, to do anything except stand there staring at my home. The figure remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 2 or 3 minutes. Then, without any warning, it moved. Not away from my townhouse, but around the side, disappearing from my line of sight toward the narrow alley that ran between my unit and Howard's empty place. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a homeless person looking for shelter, or a drunk who had wandered into the wrong complex, or even some teenager playing a stupid prank on Christmas Eve. I told myself to calm down, to think rationally, but my body refused to listen. I crept through my living room toward the back of the house, staying low, keeping away from the windows. My townhouse had a small back patio with a sliding glass door that led out to the tiny yard, and beyond that was nothing but empty desert scrubland and a wooden fence that marked the edge of the property. I had always loved that fence because it gave me privacy, but now all I could think about was how isolated I was back here, how far away from the other units, how nobody would hear me if I screamed. I reached the kitchen and peered around the corner toward the back door, straining my ears for any sound from outside. That is when I heard it, the soft metallic click of someone testing the handle on my back door. Not a knock, not a voice calling out, just the slow, deliberate sound of the handle being pushed down and released, over and over again. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making any noise, and watched the handle move in the dim light that filtered through the kitchen window. The motion was patient, almost rhythmic, and I realized with horror that whoever was out there was timing their attempts with the sound of cars passing on the main road about a quarter-mile away. Every time a vehicle drove by, creating that low hum of tires on asphalt, the handle would turn. They were using the noise to mask what they were doing, which meant this was not some confused stranger or random drunk. This was someone who had thought about this, planned this, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. My phone was on the coffee table in the living room, and the distance between me and that phone felt like miles. I waited for another car to pass, and when the handle turned again, I used the sound to cover my footsteps as I moved back toward the living room as quietly as I could. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table and immediately dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly that I had to try twice to hit the right numbers. The operator picked up after 2 rings, a woman with a calm, professional voice who asked me to state my emergency. I whispered as quietly as I could, telling her someone was trying to break into my house, giving her my address, explaining that I was alone. She asked me to stay on the line and assured me that officers were being dispatched, but then her voice changed. It dropped lower, more urgent, and she told me something that made my entire body go cold. She said she needed me to stay very quiet because there was background noise on my call, breathing, heavy and close, like someone was listening in on another line. For a moment I did not understand what she meant. I only had one phone, a cell phone, and I was the only person in the house. Then the realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Whoever was outside had somehow accessed my call, was somehow hearing everything I was saying to the dispatcher. The operator whispered for me to move to the most secure room in my house and barricade the door, to not say another word, to just listen for the sirens. I ended the call against her instructions because I could not stand the thought of that breathing on the line, of him hearing my location, my fear, everything. I ran to my bedroom at the back of the townhouse and locked the door behind me, then dragged my heavy wooden dresser in front of it with a strength I did not know I possessed. My bedroom had one window that faced the backyard, and I made sure the blinds were completely shut before I crouched down in the corner between my bed and the closet. The silence in the house was suffocating. I strained to hear any sound, footsteps, the handle turning again, glass breaking, but there was nothing. Just the distant hum of the occasional car on the main road and the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like hours. I kept checking my phone, watching the time crawl forward, wondering how long it would take for the police to arrive in this remote corner of the city on Christmas morning. Then I heard something that nearly stopped my heart, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, coming from the front of the house. It was not the sound of someone trying to force a door open. It was lighter, more controlled, like metal against wood. The scraping continued for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, then started again, then stopped. The pattern repeated 3 or 4 times before everything went silent once more. I sat in that corner, arms wrapped around my knees, praying for the sound of sirens. The sirens came about 12 minutes after I had hung up, though it felt like I had aged a decade in that time. I heard the cars pull into the complex, saw the faint flash of red and blue lights through my bedroom blinds, and finally allowed myself to breathe. There were voices outside, loud and authoritative, calling out commands and announcing their presence. I stayed in my room until I heard a knock on my front door, and a man identifying himself as Officer Hartley with the Tucson Police Department. Even then, I made him slide his badge under my bedroom door before I would move the dresser and come out. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a gray mustache and kind eyes that immediately made me feel safer. His partner, a younger woman named Reeves, was outside examining the perimeter of my townhouse with a flashlight. Officer Hartley sat me down on my couch and asked me to walk him through everything that had happened, and I told him all of it. The lights going out, the shadow at my window, the handle turning in rhythm with the passing cars, the breathing on the phone line. He listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather pad, his expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. Officer Reeves came inside a few minutes later, and the look on her face told me she had found something. She asked Officer Hartley to step outside with her, and through my front window I watched them examining my porch with their flashlights, crouching down, pointing at things I could not see from where I sat. When they came back inside, Officer Hartley sat down across from me and told me what they had discovered. The outdoor Christmas lights had not blown a fuse. Someone had deliberately unscrewed the bulbs, carefully enough that none of them were broken, just loosened in their sockets so they would not turn on. Along the doorframe of my back door, they had found fresh scratch marks in the wood, deep grooves that suggested someone had been trying to pry the door open with some kind of tool, maybe a flathead screwdriver or a crowbar. The scraping sound I had heard from my bedroom was likely the same person working on my front door. Officer Reeves said the marks were methodical, not frantic, which indicated someone who knew what they were doing and was taking their time. They asked me if I had any enemies, any ex-partners who might want to harm me, anyone who had been bothering me recently. I thought of my ex-husband immediately, but he had moved to Chicago 8 months ago and had no reason to come back. The officers stayed with me for over an hour, taking photographs of the damage, dusting for fingerprints, and canvassing the empty units nearby for any sign of the intruder. They found footprints in the soft dirt behind my backyard fence, size 11 work boots based on the tread pattern, leading out into the desert scrubland and disappearing about 50 yards from my property. Whoever it was had parked somewhere out there in the darkness, walked in on foot, and vanished the same way when the sirens approached. Officer Hartley explained that this kind of behavior, the careful planning, the timing with traffic noise, the methodical approach to entry, suggested someone who had done this before. He did not say the word serial, but I could see it in his eyes, the way he and Reeves exchanged glances when they thought I was not looking. They offered to have a patrol car sit outside my complex for the rest of the night, and I accepted without hesitation. Before they left, Officer Reeves pulled me aside and said something that has stayed with me ever since. She said I was lucky that I had noticed the lights going out. Lucky that I had looked through the blinds at that exact moment. Lucky that I had called when I did. She said most people in my situation would have just gone to check the fuse box outside, would have walked right out their front door into the darkness without a second thought. The implication was clear. If I had done that, I might not be standing here talking to her. I did not sleep that night, or the next night, or the one after that. I stayed with Denise from work for the rest of the holiday week, too terrified to set foot in my townhouse alone. In January, I broke my lease and moved to a gated apartment complex on the other side of the city, closer to downtown, where there were people and lights and noise at all hours. The police never caught whoever was outside my home that Christmas Eve. They found a partial fingerprint on one of the loosened light bulbs, but it did not match anyone in their database. Officer Hartley called me a few times over the following months to check in, and during one of those calls, he mentioned that there had been 2 similar incidents in the area over the past year, both involving women living alone in isolated units, both occurring late at night, both showing the same methodical approach to entry. In neither case had the intruder actually gotten inside. He said they had a theory that whoever this was enjoyed the hunt more than the capture, that watching the fear, testing the doors, hearing the panic in a 911 call might be the entire point. I still think about that sometimes, about the fact that he might have been listening to me beg for help, breathing into my phone, savoring every trembling word. I installed a security system in my new apartment, bought a baseball bat that I keep next to my bed, and I never, ever spend a holiday alone anymore. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Crowds were still spilling out of the park when I finally found a quieter corner to breathe. My friends had already peeled off with their partners, and I just wanted to get home and get my shoes off. I remember feeling that mix of post-fireworks buzz and exhaustion, the kind that makes everything feel slightly unreal, but not in a bad way. I opened my rideshare app, saw the wait time, and leaned against a metal barricade that someone had half crushed earlier in the night. The air still smelled like burnt powder and kettle corn, and people were laughing, stumbling, calling out to each other as they tried to reconnect in the chaos. I was sober, just tired, and trying to shake off the leftover adrenaline from the fireworks. My driver's car was listed as a charcoal sedan, pretty common, so I kept checking the little GPS dot, creeping closer. A few minutes passed before a charcoal sedan rolled up to the curb with its window halfway down. The driver leaned over and called my name, calmly, like he'd said it 1,000 times. That threw me off more than anything, because I hadn't even seen him clearly yet. He had a baseball cap pulled low, and the streetlights were doing that annoying strobe effect as people walked in front of us, blocking the glow every few seconds. I glanced at the car, same color, same make, and for a second I almost opened the door, but something nudged me to double-check the plate. It was close, incredibly close, but the last digit wasn't right. One number off. Not a typo off, like a completely different digit. I asked him about it, trying to keep my voice casual. His reaction snapped something inside me. Instead of just correcting me or explaining, he sighed loudly and waved me toward the door like I was being dramatic. He muttered something about the street being a disaster, and how he couldn't sit here all night, and his tone carried this irritated edge that felt too personal for someone I'd never met. People were squeezing past us, brushing against my shoulders, and the noise around me felt heavier suddenly. Not louder, just harder to filter. I took one step back, then another, and his expression shifted in this way I can only describe as annoyed that I wasn't cooperating with whatever script he thought I was following. He tapped the door impatiently and told me to get in unless I wanted to be stuck there another hour. Before I could even answer, another charcoal sedan rolled up behind him and idled. This driver rolled his window down and called my name too, but his voice matched the one on the app's profile clip. He held up his phone, screen glowing with my ride details. The first driver looked into his mirror, then shot me this sharp look, like I'd inconvenienced him on purpose. Without another word, he jerked the wheel and sped off, headlights off, slipping through the crowd in a way no sober person would ever attempt. A couple walking nearby jumped out of the way, shouting after him, but he didn't slow down. He just disappeared into the mess of brake lights and drifting smoke like he'd practiced that exit 100 times. I got into the real car, still trying to process how close I'd come to stepping into the wrong one. My actual driver, a guy named Marcus, kept glancing at me in the mirror with this concerned look, the kind you give someone who's clearly rattled but trying not to make a scene. He asked if everything was all right, and I told him what happened in a short, jumbled version. The moment I mentioned the missing digit on the plate, he tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He said other passengers earlier in the night had mentioned cars lingering near pickup zones, matching descriptions almost perfectly. Same make, same color, sometimes even the same aftermarket decals. Hearing that made my whole body tense up. The streets were choked with people leaving the fireworks, and every minute we crawled forward gave me more space in my head to replay the man's tone, the way he said my name with too much familiarity, like he'd practiced it. By the time we cleared the traffic and merged into quieter blocks, the excitement of the holiday felt like it belonged to a different day entirely. I kept checking the rear window even when I knew logically he wasn't behind us. Marcus tried to lighten the mood by talking about his plans to quit driving after the holiday rush, but even he couldn't hide how uneasy he seemed. At one point he said something that stuck with me. If someone's going through all that trouble to mimic a ride, they're not doing it for anything good. The thought of that made my throat tighten. I rolled down the window a crack to get some cold air, but even the breeze didn't help settle my nerves. Every charcoal sedan we passed made my chest tighten like I was seeing the same car again and again. When we reached my street, Marcus didn't pull away right after dropping me off. He waited until I was through the gate of my building before waving goodbye, something drivers almost never do anymore. Inside my apartment, the silence felt heavier than usual. My neighbors were still out celebrating, so the hallway was empty, and every little creak sounded too sharp. I put on water for tea just to have some noise, but even that didn't stop the jittery feeling running through me. My phone buzzed with a safety notification from the rideshare app, asking if I'd arrived safely. I clicked yes, then hesitated, staring at the little customer support icon. Part of me felt ridiculous reporting something that hadn't technically happened, but the other part kept replaying the man's impatient tone and how quickly he tore off once the real car arrived. Eventually, I hit the report button and typed everything out. I didn't expect much, maybe a generic response, but a few minutes later my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman from the company's safety team asking if she could ask a few follow-up questions. Her voice was steady, but there was a seriousness underneath it that made me sit down. She confirmed that the car I described didn't match any registered driver in the area. Worse, 2 other riders had called earlier about similar incidents, though in their cases the fake drivers bailed before anyone could confront them. Hearing that made my palms go damp in an instant. The woman gently suggested I contact the police because the behavior matched a pattern they'd been alerted to. I called the non-emergency line because I didn't want to blow things out of proportion. But the moment I described the missing digit on the plate and the way the guy had said my name, the dispatcher's tone sharpened. She transferred me to an officer who asked for every detail I could remember. The cap, the angle he held his arm on the window frame, the way he kept glancing at the sidewalk instead of at me. While I talked, I paced around my living room, stopping every time I realized I didn't actually want to be near the windows. The officer said they had already increased patrols near the event area after multiple women reported drivers acting strangely or circling the same blocks repeatedly. He asked if I could come in the next day to give a formal statement. I agreed, even though I barely slept after hanging up. At the station the following afternoon, the detective I spoke with laid out photos of different sedans, each one circled on maps showing their paths around the event zone. He pointed out patterns I wouldn't have noticed. Cars looping the same alleys, pulling into lots, then backing out immediately, hovering at pickup points with no assigned ride. He didn't say it outright, but I could tell from his expression that my encounter wasn't unusual that night. The fireworks had drawn out tens of thousands of people, and many were tipsy, distracted, or separated from their groups. Perfect conditions for someone looking to blend in and pick a target. The detective said one woman had actually gotten into a fake car earlier, but managed to jump out at a stoplight when she realized the driver was taking a route that didn't match her app. Walking home after giving my statement, I kept replaying how easily things could have gone in a different direction for me. The detective had explained that these men, or maybe it was just one group pretending to be multiple drivers, had refined their approach by watching how real rideshares interacted with riders. The greeting by name, the quick wave, the casual impatience. They had the script nailed down. That detail haunted me more than anything. They weren't improvising. They were practicing, planning, perfecting. My street felt different as I approached my building. Still familiar, but edged with the thought that danger doesn't always show up wearing something obvious or theatrical. Sometimes it looks exactly like what you're expecting. A few days later, the detective called to tell me they'd made progress. Surveillance caught the same sedan from my description weaving recklessly through a pedestrian crossing not long after it left me at the curb. They traced the car to an abandoned property on the outskirts of the city, but whoever had been using it had cleared out fast. No personal items, no gear, just a stack of fake plates in a cardboard box and tire marks in the dirt. The detective told me very plainly that I'd made the right call by stepping back and waiting for plate confirmation. He said that small hesitation likely kept me from becoming part of their pattern. I still think about that night whenever I leave a crowded event. How one missing digit saved me from stepping into a car, meant for someone who wasn't supposed to come back. Staying home alone that December felt strange from the start, mostly because the house always felt louder when it was just me. My wife and kids had flown out 2 days earlier to visit her parents, and I stayed behind because of work. I remember thinking that the place seemed bigger without them, like the walls carried every little sound a bit too clearly. That night, the temperature had dropped fast, and the air inside felt sharper than usual, even with the heater running. I'd gone to bed later than I should have, scrolling through old photos of the kids decorating the tree the week before. Nothing felt out of the ordinary when I finally drifted off. Just the usual quiet of a cold night settling in around me. Sometime deep in the night, a noise pulled me out of sleep. A steady series of crunches, the kind snow makes when someone heavy walks across it. At first I brushed it off as a deer or maybe a stray dog wandering near the yard. But it kept going, slow and deliberate, like whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. I sat up in the dark, listening, and the rhythm of the steps felt too purposeful to ignore. The sound moved closer to my bedroom window, not rushing, not stopping, just approaching like someone who knew exactly where they were going. I grabbed my phone and opened the porch camera feed out of habit, expecting to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. Instead of the usual grainy view of the front steps, the screen showed nothing but a cloudy blur, like the lens had been smeared with something thick. Not fog, not condensation, something that looked dragged across the glass by fingertips. That was the moment my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since the night my son wandered out of bed with a fever years ago. I got up quietly and moved through the hallway, every floorboard sounding louder than it ever had. The wind had kicked up outside, brushing frost against the siding, but beneath it I could still make out faint shifts in the snow. I stopped at the top of the stairs, trying to figure out if calling the police right then would help or just waste precious minutes. Then the testing started. A soft push against the kitchen window followed by a faint rattle of the latch. Whoever it was took their time, moving from one ground floor window to the next, as if checking them off a list. I could hear the faint scrape of a gloved hand sliding along the glass before each attempt. The pattern was so methodical it made my mouth go dry. I backed into the hallway, keeping the phone against my ear as I finally dialed 911, whispering to the operator while trying not to make any noise that might give away where I was. The minutes stretched, each sound downstairs feeling like it was happening right beside me, and all I could do was wait for help while the intruder circled the house like they had all night to spare. The operator assured me officers were on the way, but with the holiday calls stacking up, she couldn't give me a clear estimate. I stayed crouched at the top of the stairs, listening as the intruder reached the sunroom windows. That one had an old metal frame, and the sound of the person pressing against it carried through the entire house. The way they moved made it feel like they'd studied the layout beforehand, lingering longer at the windows that were easier to unlatch, barely tapping the ones I always kept locked tight. At one point, the movement paused long enough that I thought maybe they'd left, but then a soft thump came from directly beneath me, right by the basement hatch that opened to the backyard. I felt a dull ache pulse through my arms as I pressed myself against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. When the person finally reached the back door, the handle gave a slow metallic creak, as if they were testing how much pressure it would take before it snapped. I kept replaying the smeared camera lens in my head, realizing whoever this was had gotten close enough, calm enough, to touch the camera without fear of being recorded. Every couple of seconds, the intruder stepped away from the door only to return for another attempt, like they were trying to match their movements with passing gusts of wind. The absurd part is that I kept glancing at the thermostat across the room, watching the temperature drop inside the house as if it could tell me how close the person was. I sent my wife a quick text saying everything was fine, even though the last thing I felt was fine. Eventually, the footsteps drifted toward the front of the house again, but this time slower, heavier, like the person wanted me to hear them. They brushed past the living room window, their shadow crossing the faint glow from the street lamp. I couldn't make out the shape clearly, but it was tall, broader than any of my neighbors, and moving with a steadiness that made my throat tighten. Right then, a loud crack sounded outside, not from my house, but from farther up the street. Maybe someone set off a firework, or maybe ice snapped on a branch. Whatever it was, it made the person outside stop. I held my breath and waited for the next sound, but it never came. Instead, the footsteps faded, disappearing into the snow as if they'd simply dissolved into the night. By the time the officers arrived, the house had gone silent again. I met them at the door, trying to explain everything while they swept the yard with their flashlights. The beam caught a full trail of footprints circling the entire property, looping around the porch, the windows, even the garage door. The strangest part was how the tracks ended. They didn't trail off naturally or fade into the distance. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the road, right beside tire marks that cut a deep line through the frozen slush. One of the officers pointed out how clean the prints looked, like the person had been standing there for a long time before walking up to the house. The idea that someone had parked there watching me, hours before even taking a step toward the yard, made my mouth go dry. The officers did one last sweep around the property before heading back to their cruiser, leaving me with their card and a reminder to lock everything down tight. After they pulled away, the house felt colder than before, the kind of cold that sinks into the carpet and settles in the corners. I walked room to room, checking every window again, noticing tiny details I hadn't paid attention to earlier. A faint circle on the glass where a gloved thumb must have pressed. A thin line of melted snow on the inside of the back door frame. Somehow, those small traces felt worse than the noises themselves. They proved the person was confident enough to get right up against the house without hesitating, like they'd been there before, or at least practiced getting close. Sleeping that night wasn't an option. I sat on the couch with the living room lamp on, staring at the faded smear on the porch camera feed as it slowly cleared in the cold. The more I thought about it, the more it bothered me that the camera wasn't smashed or disabled. It was just covered. Someone wanted me blinded, but not alerted. I kept imagining a hand reaching toward the lens, palm first, moving slowly enough for the warmth of the skin to leave streaks across the glass. Maybe they wiped it clean on their clothing afterward. Maybe they didn't care if I saw their handprint. Either way, the idea of someone being inches from my face, separated only by a tiny camera, made it impossible to shake the uneasy buzzing beneath my ribs. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside to take a better look at the footprints before they disappeared under fresh snowfall. The pattern confirmed exactly what the officers had said. The tracks circled the house in one long, looping trail, doubling back at certain windows like the person had returned to them more than once. What shook me most was how deep the prints were near the porch camera. Whoever stood there had lingered long enough to compress the snow down to a hard, icy ring. The tire marks on the road were still visible too. They ran parallel to the property, stopping right at the point where the tracks began, like the car had been sitting there for hours with a perfect view of my bedroom and living room windows. Since that night, nothing else has happened, and no one was ever identified. The police chalked it up to someone trying random houses because of the holiday travel season, but that explanation doesn't sit right with me. The person outside wasn't guessing. They moved with intention, checking the exact points where my house was most vulnerable. I replaced the camera the next day, added more lights, reinforced the basement hatch. But the thing that sticks with me most is the quiet moment when the footsteps paused directly beneath my bedroom. It felt like they were listening. Maybe for me, maybe for movement, maybe for something I'll never understand. The only comfort I've found since then is that they left after that single night, and for reasons I hope never to learn, they didn't decide to come back. That December had been one of those months where everything felt packed and noisy. School deadlines, holiday plans, friends trying to squeeze in hangouts before everyone scattered. I'd gone to my friend Talia's house that evening to finish a history project and decompress a little. Her place sat a few blocks from mine. close enough that my parents didn't mind me walking as long as I texted updates. I remember leaving her porch with this mix of relief and tiredness, the kind that settles behind your eyes after a long day. The air had that prickly winter bite, and every breath came out in soft white clouds that drifted sideways with the wind. Streetlights hummed overhead, casting yellowish halos on the pavement. I pulled my hoodie tighter and kept moving, half lost in thoughts about finals, totally unaware of how fast that night was about to turn strange. The first sign that something wasn't right came from behind me, a quiet engine creeping along at a pace so slow it didn't fit the usual traffic on that street. I remember thinking it might be someone looking for an address, but the van kept matching my steps. When it rolled closer, I noticed the paint was a dull, uneven gray, the kind that looked hand-sprayed, almost chalky under the streetlight. The passenger window slid down just a few inches at first, and then all the way. A man with a round face and a scruffy jaw leaned out. His eyes had this unsettled darting pattern, like he was scanning for something beyond me. He asked where I lived, then said he could give me a lift before I froze out here, dragging the words like he practiced them. Something in the tone, flat but expectant, made me speed up. The van didn't peel off or yell anything. It just slowed even more, as if waiting for me to slip, hesitate, or get close enough to grab. I cut sharply across a yard I knew wasn't fenced, hopped down the other side, and bolted toward a side street that had a row of holiday lights blinking on a balcony. When I glanced back, the van had turned the opposite way, which almost confused me. Maybe they gave up. But that flicker of relief vanished fast when another vehicle, a dark compact car with a loud rattling muffler, entered the street from the far end. It drove past me once, then again, then a third time, this time slower. The windows weren't tinted, but the people inside kept their faces angled downward, only lifting their heads when they reached each corner, like they were trying not to be noticed yet searching at the same time. My house was still several blocks away, and the street I was on suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I ducked into the back lot of a small shop that had closed hours earlier, its metal security gate pulled down and locked. A big green dumpster sat wedged between the building and a brick wall, and I squeezed behind it, crouching low on the cold concrete. The sounds around me sharpened, the hum of the streetlight above, the crunch of gravel under car tires, and then the car stopping nearby. Doors slammed. I heard footsteps entering the alley, slow and deliberate. A beam of light cut across the ground, then swept upward along the brick wall. Another beam joined it. One of the men called out, his voice echoing slightly, asking where the girl in the hoodie went. Hearing that exact phrase sent a jolt through me. There was no way it was coincidence. They weren't just looking for someone, they were looking for me. The men didn't rush or stumble around like people who were confused or angry. Their movements had this unnerving confidence, like they already knew the layout of the alley and just needed to narrow down the hiding spots. One of them had a flashlight fitted with a long, narrow beam that sliced clean lines across the pavement. The other used a wider, bluish light that made the bricks glow faintly. They whispered to each other in short bursts, not enough for me to understand, but enough to tell they weren't improvising. At one point, the man with the narrow flashlight tapped the dumpster with his knuckles, 3 quick knocks, before sweeping the beam behind it. I pressed myself as small as I could, pulling my hood forward to cover the small patch of hair that wasn't hidden. The beam passed so close to my shoes that the rubber on the toes lit up. For a few seconds, all I could hear was my own breathing and the soft, static sound of their footsteps moving farther down the alley. Then one of them said something that tightened every muscle in my body. "Check behind the pallets next." There were wooden pallets stacked near the back door of the shop, and from where I was, I could see the gap between them and the wall. If they searched there and didn't find anything, it meant their next logical step would be to backtrack, straight toward the dumpster. I caught a glimpse of one of the flashlights reflecting off a window above me, and that faint, distorted reflection made everything feel unreal, like I was watching myself from another angle. I remember gripping the edge of the dumpster with my hand and feeling tiny chips of paint flaking under my fingers. Just as their steps circled closer again, a distant siren echoed from the main road. It wasn't close enough to be alarming, but close enough that the men paused. One of them muttered something sharp and irritated, and the other swung his light toward the street as if checking for patrol cars. The siren grew louder for a moment before fading, but the timing was enough to throw them off. They began retreating toward their car, still alert, still scanning the shadows, but now with this uneasy hurry in their walk. When they reached the mouth of the alley, the car headlights flicked on, briefly illuminating the brick walls in harsh white. The vehicle rolled slowly down the block, the occupants staring out both sides of the windows one last time before turning the corner. I stayed crouched behind the dumpster much longer than I probably needed to, aware that the cold from the concrete had started creeping through my jeans. My legs kept tensing and relaxing on their own, like my body couldn't decide whether to run or stay frozen in place. When I finally stood up, the world felt too quiet. No cars passing, no people walking dogs, not even the usual wind rattling the loose gutter above the shop. I peeked around the corner of the building toward the street and saw nothing but an empty intersection, the crosswalk light blinking its red hand slowly, over and over. I knew I had only a small window of safety, so I slipped out of the lot and took the back route home, cutting through yards and narrow paths I hadn't walked in years because they were always too dim. That night, they felt like the safest options I had. By the time I reached my street, the cold had settled deep into my clothes, but I barely registered it. What I kept replaying instead was the way the men had used my hoodie as a descriptor, like they'd already been watching before the van even showed up. My house came into view between two leafless trees, their branches stretching across the front yard like thin arms. One window on the second floor glowed faintly. My mom always left a lamp on when she knew I was walking home. That small patch of warm light hit me harder than I expected. I hurried up the porch steps, unlocked the door as quietly as I could, and slipped inside. The house smelled like cinnamon tea and old wood, familiar and grounding, but my nerves were still strung tight enough that every creak felt amplified. I didn't tell my parents right away. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about the whole encounter felt surreal. Like if I started talking too quickly, I'd jumble the details or sound dramatic. I went straight to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and tried to slow my breathing. From my window, I could see the faint glow of the street lamp outside and a slice of the sidewalk. For a long time, I watched that empty patch of pavement, half expecting something to turn the corner again. My phone buzzed with a message from Talia asking if I'd gotten home. I remember typing, "Yeah, all good," even though I didn't feel steady at all. Part of me was worried that saying what happened out loud would make it more real. The next morning, the local news ran a segment that made everything snap into place. A reporter stood outside a shopping center decorated with plastic reindeer and garlands, talking about an investigation into an organized group targeting young women walking alone after dark. They mentioned unmarked vans, mismatched license plates, multiple coordinated vehicles, and suspects using holiday crowds and early sunsets as cover. I sat on the couch staring at the screen while the reporter listed streets only a few blocks from where I'd been the night before. When she said law enforcement had disrupted part of the operation, but were looking for more individuals who fled, a chill threaded through me. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet understanding that the men searching that alley hadn't been random predators. They were part of something bigger, something deliberate. Later that day, I finally told my parents everything. My mom listened with this silent intensity, her hand covering her mouth. My dad kept asking for small details, positions of cars, which direction the van came from, how many voices I heard, like he could reconstruct the entire night if he gathered enough pieces. They contacted the police, who took the report seriously, but admitted they were already overwhelmed with similar tips. Still, an officer assured us they had patrols circling the area more frequently. For weeks afterward, I stuck to well-lit routes, refused to walk alone after dark, and avoided the alley behind the shop entirely. Even now, years later, when I hear a slow vehicle crawling along a quiet street, something in me tightens for a moment before logic catches up. I never learned who those men were or how long they'd been watching the neighborhood, but I know this much. If I hadn't trusted that first flicker of instinct, I might not have made it home at all.